Once, something happened that I never expected. I took my husband to the doctor for his usual checkup, but instead of everything being fine, the doctor said something really serious. Dr. Lawrence looked very serious and told me something shocking about my husband. I felt really scared and couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband, who I always looked after when he was sick, was now someone I was afraid of. The doctor even said I might need to keep away from him for my own safety. This made me feel really anxious and frightened. Hi, I'm Betty Frieden, and I've spent the last decade working at a big pharmaceutical company. It's like a second home to me, a place where I feel comfortable and like I belong. Even though I'm 50, I still work full-time, and my coworkers really respect me for it. Not many people my age are still working, but I've always enjoyed it. I think part of the reason I'm so dedicated to my job is because I didn't get married until 4 years ago. My boss, Gerald, and I are close, maybe because we're both single. Once he jokingly asked if I was ever going to tie the knot, but I knew he was just teasing. Around that time, I was seeing Richard secretly, who later became my husband. Richard's a bit older, was married before, and like me, he didn't want kids. We met through a matchmaking service for people looking for companionship in their later years. We decided to keep our relationship a secret, not telling anyone about our plans, even though our boss joked about marriage. Eventually, Richard and I quietly got married without any big ceremony, just signing papers at City Hall. I was surprised by how simple it all was, but I was really looking forward to our life together. But then, with Dr. Lawrence's worrying advice, I had to rethink everything. My caring feelings for my sick husband were now mixed up with fear and doubt. Dr. Lawrence's words kept playing in my head, telling me I needed to do something to stay safe. Standing there, trying to understand what was happening, I realized I had to make a decision, and quickly. Suddenly, the life I knew and the future I imagined felt uncertain. I'm LA, and my husband Richard works at a factory. Honestly, I make more money than he does. Richard got his job right after high school. As for me, I grew up in an orphanage and always wanted to be independent. That's why I didn't want to quit my job at the pharmaceutical company after we got married. I loved my job too much. When Richard and I got married, I told my manager Gerald right away. He congratulated me, but I could tell he had mixed feelings. Maybe he felt a bit lonely because his single buddy got married first. I tried joking with him about it, but he didn't seem to want to talk about it, so I dropped it. Despite Gerald's reaction, I was really happy about starting this new chapter with Richard. I imagined all the great things our future would bring. But reality wasn't as bright as I'd hoped. Life as newlyweds was pretty ordinary. Not much changed for me. I kept working, and the biggest change was moving to a more rural area and driving instead of taking the bus. Richard and I shared my old car because he didn't have one. About a year into our marriage, things started to get tough. Richard started showing signs of being depressed. He seemed different, barely eating breakfast, lost in thought, and even mixing up simple things like condiments. His clothes didn't match, and he became quieter both at work and at home. While I always admired Richard's quiet strength, his silence became too much, making it feel like I was living alone. This loneliness crept up on me as I noticed these small but important changes in him. I realized that Richard might be struggling with a mental health issue. Watching someone you care about struggle without knowing how to help is really tough. So I took Richard to a clinic that focuses on both mind and body health, where he was diagnosed with depression. I had a basic understanding of depression, but hearing the diagnosis made everything feel a bit darker. The doctor explained that the best way to deal with depression is to address its main cause directly. Finding the exact cause of Richard's depression was tough. He had been working at the same factory for years without any problems, and nothing major had changed in his job. If anything, I worried that maybe our marriage had something to do with it. But when we talked to the doctor, I told him we were happy together and couldn't see any obvious problems at home that might have caused Richard's depression. The doctor told us to come back if we noticed any changes or had any ideas about what might be causing it. But even after several visits to the clinic, we couldn't figure out why Richard was feeling so down. As time went on, his depression just got worse. On his worst days, he could hardly get out of bed. Sometimes he'd have headaches, or he'd call in sick to work. His appetite disappeared, and he noticeably lost weight. Eventually, he couldn't keep working and had to quit his job. Richard felt really guilty about relying on me financially, but I told him I was okay with it. My main concern was his health. It was hard to see him struggling so much, and I worried about him constantly, especially when I was at work. There was a scary moment when he got lost while out, which made me worry he might not just be dealing with depression, but maybe dementia too. This idea added to my stress. When coworkers asked how things were going, I had to admit that Richard wasn't getting better. Watching someone you love suffer so much without knowing how to help is really tough. One day, Gerald noticed I looked exhausted and gave me an energy drink. Drinking it made me feel a bit better, and I was touched by his support. He reminded me that we're all in this together, and his words nearly made me cry. With everything going on with Richard, I hadn't realized how much stress I'd been carrying. I realized I had to hold myself together, or I might fall apart too. So I focused on my work, trying to keep some normalcy in our lives. A year passed, and things with Richard didn't get better. They actually got worse. As our third wedding anniversary neared, I couldn't see any hope for his condition. Then one morning, I noticed our car was missing. I checked again, but it was definitely gone. Since Richard's diagnosis, I was the only one who drove it, and I hadn't used it since the day before, so it should have been at home. Worried, I asked Richard if he knew anything about where the car might be. He casually mentioned he thought it was there when he got home yesterday. I remembered he had gone out for a bit while I was at work. The doctor had suggested he try walking or jogging to help him cope. If the car was there when he came back, it must have disappeared sometime during the night. With the car gone, I had no choice but to use public transport, which made me about 10 minutes late for work. I told Gerald about the missing car, and although he understood that he was puzzled too, he wondered if Richard might have taken it, but I didn't think so, considering Richard's condition and how he avoided driving since he got sick. It just didn't add up. Despite Richard's memory lapses and mood swings, I couldn't imagine him being behind the missing car. The car mystery added another layer of complexity to our already difficult situation. As soon as I realized the car was gone, I reported it to the police, hoping it would be found soon. But deep down, I worried it might be gone for good. And if that wasn't enough, something else strange happened on the day I was supposed to get my paycheck. I went to the bank and found my personal account was empty. I was shocked. We did have a shared account, which I checked next, only to find it was empty too. I was completely puzzled. Richard and I shared a joint account, but he didn't have access to my personal account and he didn't know its PIN. Yet, somehow, all our savings were gone. I felt a cold shock wash over me, and when I got home, I confronted Richard. I asked him if he knew anything about the missing money from our joint account. He seemed genuinely confused and denied knowing anything about it. Because of his depression, I hesitated to push him further, worried it might make things worse for him. Richard looked distant, lost in one of his frequent dazes caused by his condition. I couldn't help but wonder if he could have taken the money without realizing it. Planning to discuss this with the police, I felt overwhelmed by the double blow of losing both our car and our savings. The financial strain was tough, especially since I didn't have family to fall back on. With the small community clinic unable to provide enough help for Richard, we decided to switch him to a larger hospital with more resources. They gave us a referral letter, so we took a taxi to our first appointment at the general hospital. The whole experience was new and a bit scary for me, and I felt uneasy throughout the journey. Richard stayed quiet, lost in his thoughts as we arrived at the hospital. Taking a deep breath, I walked in and handed over the referral letter at the reception, expecting a wait. The general hospital was bustling with patients, each waiting for their turn. After about an hour, Richard was called in for his consultation. While he went inside, I took out a book to pass the time. But hardly had Richard entered the doctor's office when a nurse approached me. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Simmons?" she asked. I confirmed, and she said the doctor wanted to see me. Familiar with discussing Richard's condition, I assumed it was a routine matter and followed her, though with some anxiety. The nurse led me to a different room, where a doctor, about 10 years older than me with graying hair and a gentle manner, greeted me. Before I could even sit down, I asked if this was about Richard's condition. He nodded seriously, and I braced myself for potential bad news. The doctor's next words caught me completely off guard. He advised me to keep my distance from my husband, revealing that Richard had been arrested for fraud a decade ago. My mind was racing with confusion. Why was this coming up now, during a routine medical visit? The doctor explained his suspicions about Richard's depression, suggesting that he might be faking it. He recalled recognizing Richard from a surgery 10 years back. where he had treated a deep cut on Richard's leg. It was a shock. I had thought we were addressing Richard's mental health, only to uncover his hidden past and a potential deception about his current condition. This unexpected revelation left me stunned, trying to reconcile the caring husband I knew with the person the doctor described. When the doctor mentioned recognizing a large scar on Richard's right leg, everything clicked into place. I knew about the scar but never knew how he got it, as Richard had never mentioned it. Finding out that the doctor before me was the one who had treated Richard's injury years ago felt like an unbelievable twist of fate. The doctor's revelation continued, unveiling that Richard had injured himself during a confrontation with his former wife, stemming from his fraudulent actions against her. He had stolen her luxury possessions and money. Shockingly, he had even pretended to have dementia during that period, tricking his wife into lowering her guard before committing the fraud. This repeated behavior of feigning illness to aid his deception was horrifying. Learning about Richard's criminal history and his arrest was overwhelming. I hadn't investigated Richard's past before marrying him. Having been alone for most of my life, I was just grateful to find someone willing to be my partner. The doctor's grave warning that Richard could pose a threat to me sent shivers down my spine. There was a gravity in his tone that made it clear this was a serious issue. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been deceived. In the days that followed, I struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy around Richard while secretly plotting my next moves. I made the decision to install surveillance cameras throughout our home to monitor Richard's actions when I wasn't present. About a week later, I noticed that a watch and bag were missing. Upon reviewing the footage from the cameras, I saw Richard leaving the house with them and returning later with a stack of cash, looking oddly pleased with himself. His behavior didn't match that of someone suffering from depression. This footage confirmed my worst suspicions. Richard was responsible for stealing my belongings, the car, and our savings. Confronted with undeniable evidence of his deceit, I felt crushed. Richard had lied to me and manipulated me, betraying the trust I had placed in him. It became clear that I needed to take significant action against someone who had pretended to be vulnerable and in need of care, only to exploit my compassion and generosity. The realization that Richard had betrayed my trust was agonizing. I had devoted myself to working and caring for what I believed was an ailing partner. Divorce seemed like too feeble a response to the profound deceit I had endured. It was evident that we needed to go our separate ways. But I desired more than just a mere separation. I wanted Richard to fully grasp the seriousness of his actions and to rectify the harm he had caused. With a heavy heart and tears threatening to spill, I gathered the divorce papers and meticulously completed them with all the necessary details. The next day, feigning normalcy, I informed Richard that I needed to step out briefly. I had already arranged to take a day off from work, explaining the urgency of my situation to my understanding employer, who had granted me the sudden leave. At the police station, I presented my case, displaying the footage I had captured of Richard's deception to the officers. Initially, they seemed hesitant to take action based solely on the video evidence. However, after confirming with the pawn shop where Richard had sold the stolen items and tracking down my car being sold as a used vehicle, the evidence against him began to accumulate. It was also discovered that he had illegally accessed my bank accounts, raising suspicions about his purported depression. As the truth came to light, I was flooded with a complex mix of relief and sorrow. The police decided to move swiftly given Richard's criminal history, and they prepared to arrest him. Upon returning home with the officers in the early afternoon, I found Richard there, visibly taken aback by my unexpected return and the presence of the police. Despite the divorce papers clutched in my hand, his focus remained on the officers as one of them announced his arrest for fraud. Richard attempted to protest, citing his depression as a defense, but I knew better. The doctor from the general hospital had already cast doubt on the legitimacy of his claims regarding his mental health condition. In that pivotal moment, as the weight of both the legal repercussions and the dissolution of our marriage settled on him, Richard's facade began to crumble. Choosing this course of action was agonizing but essential to safeguard myself and pursue justice for the betrayal and manipulation I had endured. At the police station, my sudden eruption of emotion caught even the officers off guard, but it seemed to finally pierce through Richard's veneer of composure. As the police placed him in handcuffs, Richard's facade of defiance cracked. He appeared defeated, his bravado replaced by frustration as he was escorted away. Observing the scene unfold, I felt strangely detached, as though I were watching the unraveling of someone else's life. Since the doctor's sobering warning, reality had felt distorted. Yet here I stood, confronting the stark truth of my circumstances, determined to forge ahead from the chaos Richard had wrought. Witnessing Richard being escorted away by the police felt surreal, akin to a scene from a dream. This moment marked a significant turning point, offering a glimpse of a return to the life I had known before the tumult of marriage consumed it. While a sense of relief washed over me, knowing I would no longer be ensnared in Richard's manipulative grasp, it was followed by a wave of loneliness. After waiting over 47 years to marry, the prospect of solitude once again loomed over my newfound liberation. 2 months later, our divorce was officially finalized. The process had been slightly delayed due to Richard's arrest, but as everything became official, my emotions had settled, allowing me to reflect on our shared history with clarity. Richard's future was uncertain, facing imprisonment for his second offense. I could only hope that this experience would prompt him to genuinely reconsider his choices. In the aftermath of our marriage, which had disintegrated into nothing more than a disillusioning memory, I found myself contemplating my next steps during a simple lunch at work. It was then that my boss, Gerald, approached, casually making a remark as he joined me with his store-bought hot dog lunch. "I think you'd be just fine if you were with me," he said, almost casually. His words caught me off guard, and it took a moment for their full weight to sink in, leaving me momentarily flustered. "Yes, I'm serious," he added, noticing my hesitation, his tone smooth yet sincere. I was left speechless, my lunch momentarily forgotten, as I processed his proposition. Gerald then returned to work, leaving me to mull over his unexpected offer. In the days that followed, the thought of a romantic relationship with Gerald hadn't crossed my mind, yet I couldn't ignore the care and stability he had consistently shown me. His dependable presence and responsible demeanor suddenly seemed to shine in a new light. Despite my initial surprise as I continued eating, the possibilities Gerald had introduced began to take root, hinting at a future I hadn't dared to consider until now. The idea of inviting Gerald out for a meal after work ignited a warmth within me, sparking a glimmer of hope for what lay ahead. Perhaps this was the perfect moment to embark on a fresh journey, exploring the potential for happiness and companionship once again. Stepping out of my comfort zone and into a new beginning with someone who had always been kind and supportive felt both exhilarating and reassuring. Tonight, I resolved, could mark the beginning of something wonderful and new.
My name is Veronica, and at 59, I thought I had it all figured out. A successful career, a thriving business, and a marriage that had weathered 3 decades. I met Robert when I was 27. He was a brilliant plastic surgeon with dreams of opening his own clinic. I was a business graduate with a knack for management. We clicked instantly, our ambitions aligning perfectly. Within a year, we were married and working towards our shared goal. Over the next few years, we poured our hearts and souls into establishing our clinic. It wasn't easy, but we made it work. Robert's skill as a surgeon and my business acumen proved to be a winning combination. Slowly but surely, our reputation grew. There was only one cloud on our horizon: children. Or rather, the lack of them. After 2 years of trying, we discovered Robert had fertility issues. The news hit him hard. "I'm sorry, Veronica," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know how much you wanted kids." I hugged him tight. "It's okay, Robert. We have each other, and we have our clinic. That's enough." But was it? There were times when I'd see mothers with their children and feel a pang of regret. I pushed those feelings aside, focusing instead on our growing business. As the years passed, our clinic became one of the most respected in the city. Then, about 6 months ago, I noticed something was off with Robert. His hands, those skilled hands that had transformed countless lives, were starting to shake. "Robert," I said one evening as we were going over some paperwork, "I think you should see a doctor." He brushed me off. "It's just fatigue, Veronica. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." But it wasn't just fatigue. The tremors were becoming more frequent, more noticeable. I urged him to get checked out, to consider stepping back from surgeries and focus on administrative work. He wouldn't hear of it. Despite my concerns about Robert's health, we continued to push forward with our plans for the clinic. We needed to upgrade our equipment, expand our services. It would require a significant investment, more than we could manage on our own. That's when I started reaching out to potential investors. It was a long process, filled with meetings, presentations, and negotiations. But finally, after months of work, we had a deal. The day the funds hit our account, I felt a surge of triumph. This was it, the next big step for our clinic. I decided to surprise Robert with the news over lunch. I ordered his favorites from that little Italian place down the street and set everything up in my office. The door opened, and Robert walked in. He looked tired, but his eyes lit up when he saw the spread. "What's all this?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. I grinned back. "I have some news. The investors came through. The money's in our account. We can order that new equipment we'd been eyeing." For a moment, Robert's face lit up with the boyish enthusiasm I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. He swept me into a hug, laughing. "That's fantastic, Veronica. You're amazing, you know that?" I basked in his praise, feeling like we were back on solid ground. Then he pulled back, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I have a surprise for you too," he said. "I want you to meet someone." I raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Oh, a new client?" He shook his head, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Not exactly. She's our new nurse." Before I could process this information, the door swung open, and in walked a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 22, with long blonde hair, pouty lips, and a figure that screamed recent work done. She flashed a dazzling smile at Robert before turning her gaze to me. "Hi, I'm Ella," she chirped, her voice syrupy sweet. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Henderson." I blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but I don't recall us hiring a new nurse. Especially one so young." Robert cleared his throat. "Well, that's the surprise. Ella here is eager to join our team. She's just completed her nursing courses." "Courses?" I echoed, my eyes narrowing. "Not a full nursing degree?" Ella's smile faltered slightly. "Well, not yet. But I'm a quick learner. And Dr. Henderson says he'll teach me everything I need to know." I turned to Robert, disbelief etched on my face. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" We stepped out into the hallway, leaving Ella in my office. As soon as the door closed, I rounded on Robert. "What the hell are you thinking?" I hissed. "We can't hire someone with no experience, especially not in a medical setting." Robert had the decency to look sheepish. "Look, I know it's unorthodox, but Ella is bright and eager to learn. She was a patient of mine, breast augmentation, and she was so impressed with our work that she wanted to be part of it." I felt my blood pressure rising. "Robert, this is a professional medical facility, not a fan club. We can't just hire someone because they like their boob job." His face hardened. "Keep your voice down. I've made my decision. Ella starts next week." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "If you hire her, I won't work with her. It's me or her, Robert." I expected him to back down, to realize how ridiculous this whole situation was. Instead, his next words hit me like a slap in the face. "Then I guess you should pack your things, Veronica." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 32 years of marriage, of building a life and a business together, and he was choosing this girl over me? Without another word, I turned and walked back into my office. Ella was still there, examining her reflection in the window. "Well," I said, my voice tight. "It seems congratulations are in order. The job is yours." I grabbed my purse and coat. As I walked out of the clinic, I could feel their eyes on me, Robert's conflicted, Ella's triumphant. I held my head high, refusing to let them see how shaken I was. The days following my confrontation with Robert at the clinic dragged on endlessly. Surely, I thought, Robert would come to his senses. He'd realize he needed me, not just as his wife, but as the backbone of our business. But a week passed, and still no word from Robert. I was beginning to wonder if I should reach out again when my phone rang. It was Sarah, an old friend who frequented the same social circles as Robert and me. "Veronica? It's Sarah. I'm not sure how to say this, but do you know your husband is getting married?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What? Sarah, what are you talking about?" Sarah's voice was hesitant, laden with discomfort. "I saw Robert yesterday. He was at Bella's bridal with a young woman. They were choosing a wedding dress." The conversation that followed was a blur. I thanked Sarah mechanically and hung up, my mind reeling. Without thinking, I grabbed my car keys and headed for the clinic. I marched straight to Robert's office, not bothering to knock. He looked up as I entered, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Veronica, I suppose we should discuss the details. Ella and I are getting married. She's pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the chair opposite him, struggling to breathe. "Pregnant? But, how? You're..." "Not anymore, apparently," he said with a chuckle. "Ella's been giving me some special supplements. Seems they've done the trick." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. In that moment, I realized that the man I'd loved for over 3 decades was gone. This person before me was someone else entirely. "I've had my lawyer draw up the divorce papers," Robert continued, sliding a folder across the desk. "I think you'll find the terms quite generous." Numbly, I opened the folder and scanned the documents. Despite the turmoil in my heart, my business mind kicked in, analyzing the terms. He was offering me our house, the apartment we rented out, substantial financial compensation, and alimony. In exchange, he would retain full ownership of the clinic and our other business assets. With a steady hand that belied my inner turmoil, I signed the papers. As I stood to leave, a final concern nagged at me. "Robert, your health. The tremors in your hands. You really should see a doctor. Maybe consider stepping back from surgeries for a while." He laughed, the sound grating on my nerves. "Oh, Veronica. Always the worrier. I'm fine. I feel young again, successful. Unlike some of us who are clearly ready for retirement." The days following the divorce settlement stretched out before me like an endless, empty road. For the first time in decades, I found myself without purpose, without a job to pour my energy into. The silence of my house was deafening. Initially, I tried to fill the void by visiting friends. But as I sat in their living rooms, nursing cups of tea that had long gone cold, I realized my mistake. These were our friends, mine and Robert's. Every conversation inevitably circled back to the upcoming wedding. I heard the bride's dress is being flown in from Paris. "Can you imagine?" one would say, voice hushed as if imparting a great secret. Then would come the sympathetic looks, the gentle pats on my hand. "Oh, but how are you holding up, dear? It must be so difficult." Their words, meant to comfort, felt like sandpaper against my raw emotions. The pitying smiles, the understanding nods, it was all too much. Gradually, I began to withdraw, declining invitations and screening calls. Alone in the house that now felt too big for just me, I found myself wandering from room to room, touching familiar objects that now seemed to belong to another life. In the study, my eyes fell on an old easel tucked away in the corner, gathering dust. Painting. I used to love it, before the clinic consumed all my time and energy. On a whim, I pulled out the easel, found some old canvases and paints, and set up by the large bay window in the living room. 2 months slipped by in this fashion. I was by no means healed, but I was coping. Then came the call that would change everything once again. "Ms. Henderson? This is Dr. Emily Chen from Radiant Transformations Clinic. I hope I'm not disturbing you." I recognized the name. Radiant Transformations was Robert's main competitor in the city. Not at all, Dr. Chen. How can I help you? There was a slight pause. Well, Ms. Henderson, we've heard some rumors. Is it true that you're no longer working at Henderson Plastic Surgery? And that you and Dr. Henderson have separated? I took a deep breath. Yes, that's correct. We're divorced, actually. I see. Dr. Chen's voice was carefully neutral. In that case, Ms. Henderson, I have a proposition for you. We've always admired your work in practice management. Would you be interested in joining our team here at Radiant Transformations? The offer took me by surprise. For a moment, I was speechless. Then, a slow smile spread across my face. I would be very interested, Dr. Chen. When would you like to meet to discuss details? The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Meetings, paperwork, getting to know my new team. For the first time in months, I felt alive again, energized. It was during this busy period that I happened to catch a news segment one evening. There, splashed across my TV screen, were photos of Robert and Ella, sun-kissed and smiling on a beach in the Maldives. The ticker at the bottom of the screen proclaimed, "Local plastic surgeon weds in lavish Maldives ceremony." I expected the sight to hurt, to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. Instead, I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, not even resentment. Just a vague sense of pity for the man who had thrown away decades of partnership for a fleeting infatuation. A month had passed. Life at Radiant Transformations was going well, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Is this Veronica?" A young, slightly shrill voice came through the speaker. It took me a moment to place it. "Ella?" I said, disbelief coloring my tone. "What do you want?" "It's Robert," she said, her voice trembling. "He's in trouble. A surgery went wrong. A facelift for some big shot's wife. Her face, it's all messed up. Her husband is threatening to sue us, to ruin the clinic. You have to come and fix this." The audacity of her request left me momentarily speechless. When I found my voice, it was cold and firm. "I don't have to do anything, Ella. I don't work there anymore, remember? But you always handled this stuff," she whined. "Robert needs you." I took a deep breath, tamping down my anger. I warned Robert about his tremors. I told him to see a doctor, to stop performing surgeries. It was clear he was developing symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But he wouldn't listen. "Parkinson's?" Ella scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. You're just a jealous old woman who can't stand to see Robert happy and successful." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone, a mixture of emotions swirling within me. Concern for the patient, anger at Ella's words, and a grim satisfaction at being proven right about Robert's condition. Shaking my head, I turned back to my work. Whatever mess Robert had gotten himself into, it wasn't my problem anymore. A week later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I recognized all too well. "Veronica?" Robert's voice sounded strained, desperate. "I need your help." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "It's the clinic reports," he said. "I can't make sense of them. You've always handled this stuff. Could you come in and take a look?" Part of me wanted to refuse outright, to tell him that his problems were no longer my concern. But another part, the part that had built that clinic from the ground up, couldn't bear the thought of it falling apart. "Fine," I said curtly. "I'll be there in an hour." Robert looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor to his skin that spoke of sleepless nights. But what caught my attention were his hands, trembling visibly as he shuffled papers on his desk. As I pored over the documents, a grim picture began to emerge. The clinic's finances were in disarray. But more alarmingly, there was a glaring discrepancy in the accounts. "Robert," I said slowly, looking up at him. "What happened to the money from the investors? The funds for the new equipment?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. I had to use it for other things. Other things? I pressed, my voice hardening. Like your wedding? My divorce settlement? Robert's face crumpled. I thought I could make it back quickly. If I just did a few more high-profile surgeries. Like the one that went wrong? I said, the pieces falling into place. Robert, this is serious. This is misuse of funds. The investors could sue you for this. I know, he exploded, his trembling hands sending papers flying. And now with this botched surgery. Veronica, I'm ruined. They're going to take everything. As I stood there, reports in hand, the office door swung open. Ella sauntered in, her face a mask of haughty disdain that faltered slightly when she saw me. My eyes instinctively dropped to her midsection, and I frowned. Weren't you supposed to be pregnant? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. You're not showing at all for someone who should be, 4 months along now. Ella's cheeks flushed, and she unconsciously placed a hand over her flat stomach. It's just not visible yet, she stammered unconvincingly. Ignoring her weak excuse, I turned to Robert. What exactly were those fertility treatments you mentioned? The ones that miraculously cured your infertility? Robert, looking increasingly uncomfortable, gestured vaguely towards Ella. She's been giving them to me. Some kind of herbal supplement, I think. I raised an eyebrow at Ella. Well, care to enlighten us? Reluctantly, Ella reached into her designer purse and pulled out a small pill bottle. She handed it to me, avoiding eye contact. As soon as I read the label, I couldn't help but laugh. Robert, I said, shaking my head, these aren't fertility drugs. They're just run-of-the-mill erectile dysfunction pills. They don't have any effect on actual fertility. Robert's face paled, his eyes darting between me and Ella. But she said. She lied, I said flatly. Then, a more serious thought occurred to me. Robert, you shouldn't be taking these, especially not with your condition. They can exacerbate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. They might even be speeding up its progression. The color drained from Robert's face as the implications of my words sank in. He opened his mouth, likely to berate Ella, when his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his lawyer. Robert answered, his voice shaky. Hello? Yes, this is Dr. Henderson. As he listened, I watched the last vestiges of color leave his face. His free hand, already trembling, began to shake so violently that he had to set it on the desk to steady it. I see, he said weakly. Yes, I understand. Thank you for letting me know. He ended the call and sat there, staring blankly at the phone in his hand. Robert? I prompted after a moment of heavy silence. What is it? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation that I'd never seen before. It's the investors, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They want to conduct a full audit of the clinic. They're specifically interested in how their funds for the new equipment were spent. The silence that followed the lawyer's call was deafening. I could almost hear the gears turning in Robert's head as he desperately searched for a way out of this mess. Suddenly, he looked up at me, his eyes wild with desperation. Veronica, he said, his voice trembling. I need your help. The house, or the apartment, could you sign them over to me? I could sell them, pay back the investors, and save the clinic. I stared at him, incredulous. Are you serious, Robert? You want me to give you the only things I have left after our divorce? Please, he begged, his facade of confidence completely shattered. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. The clinic, my reputation. I'll have nothing left. I felt a surge of anger rising within me. And whose fault is that, Robert? You're the one who cheated. You're the one who threw away 32 years of marriage for a pretty young thing who batted her eyelashes at you. You made your bed, now lie in it. Ella, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly piped up. "Wait a minute," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Robert. "Are you saying you're broke? That there's no money left?" Robert turned to her, desperation evident in every line of his face. "It's just temporary, sweetheart. We'll get through this together, raise our baby." Ella's laugh cut through his words like a knife. It was a cold, contemptuous sound that made even me flinch. "Baby?" she sneered. "There is no baby, you fool. I made it all up. I thought you were loaded, that I'd be set for life. But you're just a washed-up old man who can't even keep his own clinic afloat." Robert staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. But you said." "I lied," Ella said bluntly. "And now, I want a divorce. I'll be taking half of everything, including this precious clinic of yours." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Both Robert and Ella turned to look at me, shocked by my outburst. "Oh, honey," I said, shaking my head at Ella. "The only thing you two will be sharing is debt and legal fees. There's nothing left to take." Robert slumped into his chair, looking utterly defeated. Ella's face contorted with rage as the reality of the situation sank in. I'd seen enough. Without another word, I gathered my things and headed for the door. Behind me, I could hear Ella's shrill voice rising in anger, Robert's pleading responses, but I didn't look back. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen at Radiant Transformations. There was a new project she wanted my input on, something that could potentially revolutionize our approach to patient care. Weeks passed, and I threw myself into my work at Radiant Transformations. The new project was challenging and rewarding, allowing me to apply my years of experience in innovative ways. I was so engrossed in my new life that I barely thought about Robert or the old clinic anymore. Then one evening, as I was unwinding with a glass of wine and the evening news, a familiar name caught my attention. The renowned plastic surgeon Dr. Robert Henderson has been sued for medical negligence and deliberate concealment of illness, the anchor announced. I sat up straighter, my wine forgotten as I listened intently. The story unfolded like a tragic play. Robert had been forced to pay substantial financial compensation to the patient whose facelift he had botched. Worse still, the medical board had revoked his license to practice, citing his failure to disclose his Parkinson's diagnosis as a grave breach of professional ethics. As the days went by, more news trickled in. The once prestigious Henderson Plastic Surgery Clinic was hemorrhaging clients. Its reputation, built over decades of hard work, was in tatters. Then came the final blow. The investors, upon discovering the misuse of their funds, sued the clinic. Robert, drowning in debt and legal troubles, had no choice but to sell the clinic to pay off his debts and settle the claims against him. I felt a complex mix of emotions, sadness for the downfall of something I had helped build, anger at Robert's recklessness, and a strange sense of vindication. But mostly, I felt relief that I was no longer entangled in that mess. A few days later, Dr. Chen called me into her office. Her expression was unreadable as I took a seat across from her. "Veronica," she began, "I have some news that might interest you. Radiant Transformations has just acquired a new property." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh?" She smiled. "We've purchased the Henderson Plastic Surgery Clinic." For a moment, I was speechless. Of all the potential buyers, I never imagined it would be Radiant Transformations. "I see," I managed to say. "That's unexpected." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. "Here's the thing, Veronica. We need someone to manage this new acquisition. Someone who knows the ins and outs of the place, who can turn it around and restore its reputation. Someone like you." I blinked, taken aback. "Me? But You built that clinic from the ground up," Dr. Chen said softly. "Who better to breathe new life into it?" As her words sank in, I felt a surge of emotions. Fear, excitement, nostalgia, determination, they all swirled within me. But above all, I felt a sense of coming full circle. "I'd be honored," I heard myself say. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Walking back into the clinic that had been my second home for so many years was surreal. There were new challenges, of course, rebuilding the clinic's reputation, reassuring old clients, and integrating with Radiant transformation systems. But with each passing day, I felt more and more in my element. One evening, as I was locking up the clinic, I paused to look at the new sign above the door. Radiant Transformations at Henderson, it read. A perfect blend of old and new, just like me. As I drove home, I couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns my life had taken. A year ago, I had been cast aside, feeling lost and betrayed. Now, I was back where I belonged, stronger and wiser for the experience. My phone buzzed with a message from a friend, inviting me to join a group for a painting class over the weekend. I smiled, realizing I now had the time and freedom to pursue such pleasures. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. I was happy, truly happy, for the first time in a long while. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a deep sense of contentment wash over me. My name is Nina, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. I grew up in a world of privilege, the only child of Robert and Elizabeth Collins. My father was a self-made man, having built his business empire from the ground up. He was stern but loving, always pushing me to be my best. My mother, on the other hand, was the epitome of grace and sophistication, moving through high society circles with ease. Our family lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. I had everything a girl could want, the best education, designer clothes, exotic vacations. But despite all the material comforts, there was always a part of me that felt empty. Enter Mark Johnson. I met him during my final year of college, and it was like a bolt of lightning struck me. He was charming, handsome, and seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. There was just one problem: my parents hated him. Nina, darling, my mother said one evening over dinner, don't you think Mark is attracted to you not only by your inner qualities, but also by our money? My father chimed in, his face set in a hard frown. He's got no prospects, no ambition. He's not the kind of man who can give you the life you're accustomed to. I don't care about any of that. I shouted, pushing away from the table. I love him, and he loves me. Isn't that what matters? Things came to a head when Mark proposed. It was a simple affair, no fancy restaurant, no elaborate setup. Just the two of us, walking in the park where we had our first date. He got down on one knee, pulled out a modest ring, and asked me to be his wife. I said yes without hesitation. When I told my parents, all hell broke loose. If you marry him, you're no longer welcome in this house, my father roared. Daddy, please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. Can't you just be happy for me? But he wouldn't budge. My mother stood silently by his side, her face a mask of disappointment. I left that night, my heart breaking, but my resolve firm. I moved in with Mark, into the small apartment he shared with a roommate. It was a far cry from the luxury I was used to, but I was determined to make it work. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning and stress. I kept hoping my parents would come around, that they'd realize how much their presence meant to me. But as the big day approached, it became clear they weren't going to change their minds. As I walked down the aisle, I scanned the faces of our guests, still holding out hope that I'd see my parents. But they weren't there. For a moment, sadness threatened to overwhelm me. Then I saw Mark, standing at the altar, looking at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. In that moment, everything else faded away. My parents' absence, the modest surroundings, the uncertain future, none of it mattered. I was marrying the man I loved, and that was enough. After the wedding, Mark and I moved into the luxury apartment in the city center that my beloved grandfather had left me. It was a stark contrast to Mark's old place, spacious, with high ceilings, and a view of the city skyline. I spent days decorating it, trying to make it feel like our home. As the days turned into weeks and then months, we settled into married life. Mark threw himself into his work at a local marketing firm, often coming home late but always with a smile and a kiss for me. I busied myself with setting up our home and volunteering at a local animal shelter. About a year and a half after our wedding, our lives changed forever. I still remember the day I found out I was pregnant. My hands were shaking as I held the positive test, a mix of excitement and terror coursing through me. When I told Mark, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. "We're going to be parents," he exclaimed, picking me up and spinning me around. "Nina, this is amazing." When our son, Jacob, was born, I was overwhelmed with love. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a shock of dark hair, just like his father's. Through the haze of exhaustion and joy, I snapped a picture of him and sent it to my parents. I waited for a response. A call, a text, anything. But there was nothing but silence. "They'll come around," Mark assured me, seeing the hurt in my eyes. How could they resist this little guy? I tried to push the disappointment aside and focus on our new family. A few months after Jacob was born, I decided it was time for me to get back to work. I found a part-time position as a manager at a local boutique. Balancing work, a newborn, and keeping the house in order was a challenge, but I was determined to make it work. I'd wake up early to feed Jacob, drop him off at daycare, work my shift, pick him up, make dinner, clean the house, and collapse into bed, only to do it all over again the next day. But as Jacob neared his first birthday, I started to notice changes in Mark. He became more distant, often coming home even later than before. When he was home, he seemed distracted, always on his phone. "Everything okay at work?" I asked one night as we got ready for bed. "Yeah, just busy," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Big project coming up." As I drifted off to sleep that night, Jacob's soft breathing coming through the baby monitor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I pushed it aside. We were happy, weren't we? We had a beautiful son, a lovely home, good jobs. What more could I want? The changes in Mark became more pronounced as time went on. One evening, as I was putting Jacob to bed, Mark cornered me in the nursery. "Nina, we need to talk," he said, his tone unusually serious. "I think you should quit your job." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "Quit my job? Why?" "Look around," he gestured vaguely. "The house is a mess. Jacob needs more attention. I think it would be better if you focused on being a full-time mom and housewife." I felt like I'd been slapped. But I love my job. And I thought we were managing just fine. Mark's face hardened. "Well, we're not. I'm the man of this house, and I'm telling you, it's time to quit." We argued late into the night, but in the end, I gave in. I told myself it was for the good of our family, that Mark was just stressed from work. The next day, with a heavy heart, I handed in my resignation. At first, I threw myself into my new role with gusto. I deep cleaned the apartment, tried new recipes, and spent hours playing with Jacob. But as the days wore on, I found myself missing the structure and satisfaction of my job. Meanwhile, Mark's behavior continued to change. He started coming home later and later, often smelling of alcohol. Our bank account, which I had access to, showed mysterious withdrawals. One night, as I was folding laundry, I confronted him. "Mark, where is all our money going? We're barely making ends meet." He exploded. "Maybe if you knew how to budget properly, we wouldn't have this problem." I recoiled, shocked at his outburst. This wasn't the man I married. Things only got worse from there. Mark began criticizing everything I did. The house was never clean enough, dinner was never good enough, I wasn't attentive enough to Jacob. The final straw came when Jacob got sick with a nasty flu. He was running a high fever and crying constantly. I was at my wit's end, having been up for 2 nights straight. "Mark, please," I begged. "Can you take a day off work to help me with Jacob? I'm exhausted." He looked at me like I was crazy. "Take a day off? Are you kidding? Some of us actually have to work for a living, Nina. The next day, he came home with a suitcase. "I'm going to a hotel for a few days," he announced. "I need to rest after work, not listen to a screaming kid." I was stunned. "You're leaving us? Now?" He shrugged, already heading for the door. "Taking care of Jacob is your job, not mine. Call me when he's better." As the door slammed behind him, I sank to the floor, Jacob wailing in my arms. What had happened to us? To the man who had once looked at me like I hung the moon? In that moment, I missed my parents more than ever. I wanted to call them, to hear my mother's soothing voice, to feel my father's protective embrace. But pride and shame held me back. How could I admit that they had been right all along? As I rocked Jacob, trying to soothe both his cries and my own, I couldn't help but think about the words my father had said on the day I told them about my engagement. "He's not the man you think he is, Nina." The days following Mark's departure to the hotel were a blur of sleepless nights and exhausting days. Jacob's fever finally broke, and as his health improved, I found myself with more time to think, perhaps too much time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in my marriage. The man who had returned from the hotel was not the Mark I had fallen in love with. He was distant, irritable, and seemed to resent both Jacob and me. One evening, about a week after he'd returned, Mark came home earlier than usual. His face was serious, and he was clutching some papers. "Nina, we need to talk about insurance," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I've taken out a life insurance policy on myself for $1 million. I think you should do the same." The amount made my head spin. $1 million? Mark, that seems excessive. And why do I need such a large policy? I don't even work outside the home anymore. His eyes hardened. "It's for Jacob's future. In case anything happens to either of us. Don't you want to make sure he's taken care of?" Put that way, I couldn't argue. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. "I suppose you're right," I said slowly. "If you think it's best." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'll set up the appointment with the insurance agent." Over the next few days, I noticed Mark's behavior becoming even stranger. He was constantly on his phone, texting at all hours. Whenever it rang, he'd leave the room to answer, often locking himself in our home office. One morning, after Mark left for work, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty anymore. I needed answers. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found online. "Hawkeye Private Investigations, how can I help you?" a gruff voice answered. I took a deep breath. I need someone to follow my husband. I think he might be." I couldn't bring myself to say the words, but the investigator seemed to understand. "I see, ma'am. Why don't you come into our office and we can discuss the details?" That afternoon, while Jacob was napping, I met with the investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda. I told her everything, the late nights, the secret of phone calls, the drastic personality change. Linda listened intently, taking notes. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Johnson. I'll have my best guy on it." As I left her office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Part of me hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation for Mark's behavior. But a larger part knew that whatever the investigator uncovered was likely to change my life forever. 3 weeks after hiring the private investigator, I received the call I had been both dreading and anticipating. "Mrs. Johnson, we have the report ready," Linda's voice came through the phone. "You might want to sit down for this." With trembling hands, I sank into a chair, my heart pounding. "I'm ready. Tell me everything." As Linda spoke, I felt my world crumbling around me. Mark, my husband, the father of my child, had been unfaithful. He had a mistress. The evidence was irrefutable: photographs, text messages, hotel receipts. It was all there in black and white. I waited until Mark left for work the next morning before springing into action. With shaking hands, I packed a bag for myself and Jacob, throwing in only the essentials. clothes, diapers, a few of Jacob's favorite toys. I couldn't bear to look at the photos on the walls, the happy memories that now felt like lies. "We're going to see Grandma and Grandpa," I cooed to Jacob as I put him in the stroller. He giggled, oblivious to the turmoil around him. I decided to take the metro to my parents' house. It would be faster than driving through rush hour traffic. As I approached the station, my mind was racing, planning our next steps. That's when it happened. I was crossing the street, pushing Jacob in his stroller, when suddenly there was a screech of tires. I turned my head and saw a car hurtling towards us. In a split second, I pushed the stroller out of the way. Then, pain. Blinding, all-consuming pain. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room. The steady beep of machines filled the air. And there, sitting by my bed, looking haggard and worried, was Mark. "Jacob," I croaked, my throat dry. "Where's Jacob?" Mark leaned forward, taking my hand. "He's fine, Nina. He's with Lisa, your best friend. Not a scratch on him." Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a wave of pain. I looked down at my legs, both encased in casts. "You have multiple fractures in both legs," Mark explained gently. "The doctors say it'll take about a year for you to fully recover. You'll need to use a wheelchair for a while." I closed my eyes, trying to process this information. A year. A wheelchair. And then, like a bolt of lightning, I remembered why I had been at that metro station in the first place. "I know about her," I blurted out, my eyes snapping open to gauge Mark's reaction. "Your mistress." "I know everything." Mark's face paled. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it. Then his shoulders slumped. "Nina, it wasn't serious. It was a stupid mistake," he stammered. "When I got the call about your accident, I realized how close I came to losing you." "I can't lose you, Nina. Please, can we start over? Give me another chance. I'll do better, I promise." I looked at him, this man I had loved for so long. He seemed so sincere, so remorseful. And I was so tired, so overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Okay," I heard myself say. "We can try." The day I was discharged from the hospital was surreal. Mark arrived with a bouquet of my favorite flowers, pink peonies. His smile seemed genuine, his eyes filled with concern and love. As he wheeled me out of the hospital, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work after all. The first 2 weeks at home were surprisingly nice. Mark was attentive, caring, almost doting. He helped me with everything, from getting dressed to bathing. He'd carry me to the bathroom in his arms, careful not to jostle my injured legs. It reminded me of our early days together, when every touch felt electric. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Nina, I've been thinking," he said, taking my hand. "We should get away for a weekend. Just the two of us. To celebrate your recovery and, well, us." My heart skipped a beat. "Really? Where?" "I found this cozy little house in the mountains, overlooking a beautiful canyon." "What do you say?" I couldn't help but smile. "That sounds wonderful. But what about Jacob? And I'm in a wheelchair. I'm sure Lisa wouldn't mind watching him for a couple of days." "About the wheelchair. If anything, I'll carry you in my arms." "Come on, it'll be good for us." I agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This could be exactly what we needed to reconnect. The drive to the mountains was peaceful. As we wound our way up the narrow road, I felt the tension of the past months slowly melting away. The house, when we arrived, was everything Mark had promised: cozy, secluded, with breathtaking views of the canyon. "I'm going to explore a bit," Mark said after we'd settled in. "Why don't you rest?" I nodded, watching him disappear down a trail. Left alone, I decided to check my emails. I hadn't had a chance to do so since the accident. My phone was nowhere to be found, so I wheeled myself over to Mark's laptop. As I opened the browser, an email notification popped up. It was from an unfamiliar address, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Urgent, new information about your case. With trembling hands, I clicked on it. The message was from Linda, the private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. My heart pounded as I read. Mrs. Johnson, I've been trying to reach you. Your number is out of service. I've uncovered disturbing new information. You're in danger. Your husband was involved in your accident. He's trying to get rid of you for the insurance money and your apartment. His mistress was driving the car that hit you. I've attached evidence, photos, videos, texts. Please contact me immediately. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. There was Mark, plotting with his mistress. There were bank statements showing large withdrawals. There was a grainy video of a woman who looked remarkably like Mark's assistant behind the wheel of a car, moments before impact. Just as I closed the laptop, Mark walked in. I tried to compose myself, but my heart was racing. Everything okay, Nina? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. I forced a smile. Yeah, I can't find my phone. Have you seen it? A cold smile played on Mark's lips. Oh, that. It broke down suddenly. Must have been damaged in the accident. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to contact someone, anyone, but how? Mark, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Could I borrow your phone? I want to check on Jacob, see how he's doing with Lisa. He hesitated for a moment, then handed me his phone. Sure, go ahead. I'll just be right here. My hands trembled as I took the phone. Mark hovered nearby, watching. I knew I couldn't call the police or even Lisa. Then, a memory flashed in my mind, a conversation with my father years ago. If you're ever in trouble and can't speak freely, ask about Buddy the bear. I'll know you need help. Praying my father hadn't changed his number, I dialed. When he answered, I put on my brightest voice. Hey, Lisa. How's everything going? How's Buddy the bear doing? There was a pause, and I held my breath. Then my father's voice came through, deliberately high-pitched to sound feminine. Oh, you know, same old, same old. How are you? Relief washed over me. He understood. Oh, it's lovely up here, I gushed, aware of Mark's eyes on me. We're at this beautiful cabin, 1247 Pine Ridge Road. The view of Evergreen Canyon is just stunning. I see, my father said carefully. When do you think you'll be back? Oh, I dream of seeing you right now, this very second. I said emphatically. I miss you guys already. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, I hung up. Mark seemed satisfied, not suspecting anything amiss. As evening approached, Mark suggested a walk. The sunset over the canyon is beautiful. We shouldn't miss it. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had no choice. That sounds nice, I managed to say. Mark wheeled me out onto a narrow path that wound along the edge of the canyon. The view was breathtaking, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the canyon stretching endlessly before us, but all I could think about was the sheer drop just feet away. As Mark pushed my wheelchair, chatting about the scenery as if everything was normal, I closed my eyes and prayed. Please, Dad, I thought desperately. Please find me in time. The path curved one last time, and suddenly we were at the edge of the cliff. Mark turned my chair around, and our eyes met. The loving facade he'd maintained crumbled away, revealing a stranger with eyes full of anger and hatred. You know, Nina, he said, his voice cold and detached. I'm really sorry it had to come to this. The car accident was supposed to take care of everything, but you just had to survive, didn't you? My blood ran cold as the full truth of my situation hit me. Mark, please, I whispered, don't do this. He laughed mirthlessly. Do you have any idea how perfect this is? A tragic accident at a scenic overlook. Your wheelchair rolls off the edge when the brakes fail. I'll be the grieving widower, inherit your apartment, and cash in that $1 million insurance policy. It's foolproof." As he spoke, he inched my wheelchair closer to the edge. I closed my eyes, silently praying for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard shouts and running footsteps. My eyes flew open to see my father sprinting down the path, followed closely by several police officers. "Nina," my father yelled, reaching us just as Mark was about to push me over. He grabbed the handles of my wheelchair, yanking me back from the brink. Everything happened in a blur after that. The police tackled Mark to the ground, reading him his rights as they handcuffed him. I sat there, shaking, as the reality of what had almost happened washed over me. My father knelt beside my wheelchair, pulling me into a tight embrace. I broke down, sobbing into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I choked out between sobs. "You were right about him. I should have listened to you." He stroked my hair gently, his own voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart. I'm the one who should be sorry. We let our pride keep us apart. Can you forgive us for not being there for you and Jacob?" I nodded, unable to speak through my tears. We stayed like that for a long moment, years of hurt and misunderstanding melting away. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. I filed for divorce, and with the overwhelming evidence against him, Mark was sentenced to prison for attempted murder, along with his mistress who had driven the car in the original accident. I sold the apartment that held so many painful memories and bought a new one, close to a good school for Jacob and just a few blocks from my parents' house. I moved back in with my parents during my rehabilitation. It was a year of healing, both physically and emotionally. My parents doted on Jacob, making up for lost time with their grandson. Slowly, I learned to trust again, to smile again, to hope again. My name is Chloe, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down, not once, but twice. I guess I should start at the beginning. I was born to loving parents, Mark and Lisa Smith, in a small suburban town. Dad was a journalist, and Mom worked as a nurse. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Life was pretty normal until I turned 12. That's when everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and my parents were driving home from a dinner party. I was at home with my grandma, watching some silly cartoon when the phone rang. I'll never forget the chill that ran down my spine when I heard my grandma's muffled sobs from the kitchen. The next few days were a blur. Mom died on impact, they told us. Dad survived, but barely. When I finally got to see him in the hospital, he was a shell of the man I knew. His legs were crushed, and the doctors said he'd never walk again. "Chloe," he croaked, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I'm so sorry." I didn't understand why he was apologizing. It wasn't his fault some drunk driver had plowed into their car. But as I grew older, I realized he was sorry for what our lives had become, for the struggles we'd face, for the mother I'd lost, for the father he thought he could no longer be. But my dad, Mark Smith, was made of stronger stuff than he gave himself credit for. Once he was out of the hospital and settled into his wheelchair, he threw himself into his work. He'd always been a talented writer, and now he channeled all his energy into his job as an editor at the city's major newspaper. As I entered my teens, Dad made sure I had everything I needed. He encouraged me to join clubs, to make friends, to have as normal a life as possible. But the truth was, I preferred spending time with him. We'd watch old movies together, argue about books, and he'd help me with my homework. When it came time for college, Dad insisted I go away to school. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he said. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." I was hesitant, but I knew he was right. So off I went to State University, majoring in accounting. It was there that I met Jessica, who would become my best friend. And through Jessica, I met her second cousin, Michael. Michael was kind, funny, and he didn't bat an eye when I told him about my dad. In fact, the first time he met Dad, they hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of classic rock. Your old man's cool, Michael told me later. And you're pretty amazing for taking care of him all these years. I shrugged it off, but inside, I was glowing. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life. A life with love, laughter, and yes, even a family of my own someday. After graduation, life seemed to fall into place like pieces of a puzzle. I landed a job at the local tax service, and Michael started working as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 2 years before he popped the question on a crisp autumn evening in the park where we had our first date. I was over the moon, but there was one thing I needed to make clear. Yes, Michael. But I can't leave my dad. He needs me. Michael's face broke into a wide grin. I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right? The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. As I stood there, hand in hand with Michael, I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains, and mine came in the form of my mother-in-law, Karen, and sister-in-law, Emily. From the moment I met them, I could tell they didn't approve of me. So, your father is handicapped? Karen had asked during our first meeting, her nose wrinkling as if she'd smelled something unpleasant. He's disabled, I corrected, trying to keep my tone neutral. But he works as an editor, Anne. How nice, she interrupted, clearly uninterested. Michael, darling, are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families. I felt my face burn with anger and shame. Michael, bless him, immediately jumped to my defense. Mom, Chloe is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters. That shut Karen up, but I could see the disapproval lingering in her eyes. Emily, taking cues from her mother, was equally cold towards me. After the wedding, true to his word, Michael moved in with Dad and me. Our life fell into a comfortable routine. I'd go to work at the tax office, Michael would be on the road for days at a time, and when he was home, we'd all have dinner together. But whenever Karen and Emily visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They'd strut around like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once, I overheard Karen muttering to Emily, "It's a shame. Michael could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious, but I bit my tongue. For Michael's sake, I tried to keep the peace. But it was getting harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Karen and Emily, I broke down in tears. Michael found me in our bedroom, sobbing. Hey, he said, pulling me into his arms. What's wrong? Your mom and sister, I hiccuped. They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad. Michael's face hardened. That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours. His words comforted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Karen and Emily. As the months passed, Michael's trucking business began to flourish. He was always on the road, crisscrossing the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I threw myself into my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Michael called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. Chloe, I've been thinking, he said. How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden. Something to keep you busy when I'm on the road. The more he talked, the more I warmed to the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. What do you think, Dad? I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. A garden would be nice, he admitted. And it would be easier to get outside. That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was scary, but with Michael's income and mine, plus the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Saturday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." We spent the next few months settling in, making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, soaking up the sun and fresh air. It was idyllic. Then came the housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, Karen and Emily. The party was in full swing when they arrived, fashionably late as usual. They sauntered in, eyeing everything with barely concealed envy. As we moved through the house, I could see the wheels turning in Karen's head. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Chloe," she said, her voice low. "This would be perfect for Michael and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me?" "Oh, don't look so shocked," Karen continued. "Your father isn't, well, he's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition." Before I could respond, Karen marched out to the patio where Dad was chatting with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him towards the driveway. "Karen!" I shouted, running after her. "What are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," she sneered. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors?" I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Michael had heard the commotion and came running. His face turned red with anger when he saw what his mother was doing. "Mom," he bellowed. "What the hell are you doing? Let go of Mark's chair right now." Karen looked shocked at Michael's tone. "But honey, I was just—" "I don't want to hear it," Michael cut her off. "You and Emily need to leave. Now." After they left, Michael apologized profusely to Dad and me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea she would. I'm just so sorry." Dad reached out and patted Michael's hand. "It's not your fault, son. Some people, they just can't understand." Life settled into a new rhythm after the housewarming incident. Karen and Emily kept their distance, which suited me just fine. Michael threw himself into his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help cover our new mortgage. I split my time between my job at the tax office and tending to our home and Dad. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Our life fell into a comfortable routine. Michael was on the road more often than not, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. An unfamiliar male voice greeted me. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Officer Rodriguez from the Highway Patrol." My heart dropped into my stomach. "Yes?" I managed to squeak out. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Michael Thompson, has been in a serious accident." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Words like head-on collision and "didn't make it" floated around me, but I couldn't process them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that reality began to sink in. Michael was gone. The next week was a haze of grief and disbelief. I moved through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The day before the funeral, I steeled myself and called Karen. I thought she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from some impersonal newspaper obituary. "Hello?" Karen's sharp voice answered. "Karen, it's Chloe," I said, my voice trembling. It's about Michael. He's gone. There was an accident." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, to my shock, Karen's voice came back, dripping with venom. "This is your fault," she hissed. You forced him to work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son. I was stunned. Karen, that's not. Save it, she snapped. I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy. But don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Michael's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. The church was packed. Michael had been well liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to pay their respects. After the service, as people filed past to offer their condolences, I was struck by the absence of Michael's mother and sister. They hadn't even bothered to show up to their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. Their loss, sweetie. We're family, and we'll get through this together. As we pulled into our driveway, something seemed off. The lights were on in the house, which was strange, because I was sure I'd turned everything off before we left. Did you leave any lights on, Dad? I asked, frowning. He shook his head. No, I don't think so. As we got closer, I could see movement inside the house. My heart started racing. Were we being robbed? On the day of Michael's funeral, no less? I helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside. My blood ran cold as I recognized them. I pushed open the door to find Karen and Emily in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Karen turned to me, her face a mask of false sympathy. Oh, Chloe, dear. We're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Michael's gone. I was speechless. Emily chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet. Don't worry, you can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy. I could feel the rage building inside me. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Get out of my house right now. Karen had the audacity to look offended. This house belongs to us now. All of Michael's property does. We're his real family, after all. Like hell you are, I exploded. Where were you today? At his funeral? Oh, that's right, you couldn't be bothered to show up. Karen waved her hand dismissively. We were busy making arrangements. Now, be a good girl and start packing. We'll need you out by tomorrow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Michael, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home? I'm calling the police, I said, pulling out my phone. Karen and Emily exchanged worried glances. They clearly hadn't expected me to fight back. Now, Chloe, Karen began, but I cut her off. No. You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Michael and I bought it together. You have no right to be here. Maybe it was the steel in my voice, or the fire in my eyes, but Karen and Emily finally seemed to realize they'd gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Karen turned to me with a sneer. This isn't over, Chloe. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. The days following Michael's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Michael's affairs, partly to keep busy and partly out of fear that Karen and Emily would try to swoop in and take what wasn't theirs. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a local law firm. My heart raced as I answered, fearing it was Karen making good on her threat of legal action. Mrs. Thompson, a crisp, professional voice asked. This is James Anderson from Anderson and Partners. I'm calling regarding your late husband's will. I felt a glimmer of hope. His will? I didn't know he had one. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Thompson came to see us about 6 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing. I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind reeling. Why hadn't Michael told me about this? What did it mean? The next morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Anderson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Smith, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing for us to settle near his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss." Mr. Anderson opened a file on his desk. "Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes." I held my breath as Mr. Anderson began to read. "I, Michael Thompson, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Chloe Thompson." I gasped. Dad's grip on my hand tightened. Mr. Anderson continued, "This includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Chloe use these resources to care for herself and her father, Mark Smith, whom I have come to love as my own." Tears were streaming down my face now. Even from beyond the grave, Michael was taking care of us. "There's more," Mr. Anderson said gently. "Mr. Thompson left a letter for you." He handed me an envelope. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. "My dearest Chloe, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Mark. Please know that you two were the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Mark were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Chloe. You and Mark. Not them. Take care of each other. Live your lives to the fullest. And know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, Michael." I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing. Dad was crying too, his weathered hand patting my arm. Mr. Anderson gave us a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing. Your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy." I looked up, sniffling. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Anderson said with a small smile, "that you'll be receiving a substantial sum. Enough to pay off your mortgage and then some." As we left the lawyer's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We were going to be okay. Michael had made sure of it. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Karen's sleek sedan. "Oh no," I muttered. "What now?" Sure enough, Karen and Emily were waiting on our front porch. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had Michael's letter in my pocket and the strength of his love in my heart. "Chloe," Karen began as we approached, her voice sickly sweet. "We need to talk about Michael's estate." I stood tall, looking her straight in the eye. "No, Karen. We don't. Michael left everything to me. It's all legal and official. And do you want to know why? Because we were his real family. Not you. Now, please leave. You're trespassing on my property." For once, Karen was speechless. Emily tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, they got in their car and drove away. The weeks following our meeting with the lawyer were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into settling Michael's affairs, grateful for the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout came through, and true to Mr. Anderson's word, it was enough to pay off our mortgage, with plenty left over. One afternoon, as I was going through Michael's desk, I came across a small notebook. Curious, I opened it and found pages filled with his messy scrawl. It was a journal of sorts, filled with his thoughts and plans for our future. Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids, one entry read, "Want to make sure they have the best start in life." My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday, but had decided to wait until we were more financially stable. Now, reading Michael's private hopes and dreams, I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. "Oh, Michael," I whispered, clutching the notebook to my chest. "We had so many plans. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind kept drifting to the journal, to the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Michael. He was smiling, holding out his hand to me. "It's okay, Chloe," he said in my dream. "Everything's going to be all right." I woke up the next morning feeling different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something had changed. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it to the bathroom in time. But as the days went by, the morning sickness persisted. At first, I chalked it up to stress and grief. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered another possibility. Finally, after a week of this, I found myself standing in the pharmacy aisle, staring at pregnancy tests. With trembling hands, I bought one and hurried home. The 3 minutes I waited for the result were the longest of my life. When I finally looked at the test, I saw 2 clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, a mix of emotions overwhelming me. Joy, fear, grief, hope, they all swirled together in a dizzying cocktail. "Chloe?" Dad's voice came through the door. "Everything okay in there?" I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. Dad's expression immediately changed from concern to alarm. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. I held up the test, my hand shaking. "I'm pregnant, Dad." I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me, stroking my hair like he used to when I was a little girl. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone, Chloe. And this baby is a gift. A piece of Michael that will live on." His words struck a chord in me. This baby was a part of Michael, a continuation of our love. Suddenly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. "You're right," I said, wiping my eyes. "This baby is a gift. And we're going to be okay." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's my girl. Now, let's get you something to eat. You're eating for 2 now, after all." As we made our way to the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope blooming in my chest. Yes, the road ahead would be challenging. But with my father by my side and Michael's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. As my belly grew with our child, I found strength I never knew I had. Dad was my rock, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. We settled into a new routine, just the 2 of us, eagerly anticipating the arrival of the newest member of our little family. One sunny afternoon, as I was tending to the garden Dad and I had planted together, I heard a car pull up. My heart sank as I recognized Karen's sedan. What could they possibly want now? I made my way to the front of the house, one hand instinctively cradling my swollen belly. Karen and Emily stood on our porch, looking uncomfortable and slightly desperate. "Chloe," Karen began, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. We need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Emily chimed in, her eyes darting around nervously. "We've hit some hard times. We were wondering if we could stay in your father's old apartment. Just until we get back on our feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd put us through, they had the audacity to ask for more? "I'm sorry," I said, my voice firm but calm. "That's not possible. I don't want to communicate with you anymore." Karen's eyes narrowed as they fell on my pregnant belly. Her face contorted with a mix of shock and disgust. You're pregnant?" she spat. "Already? You little prostitute. I can't believe you've already found a new man. Michael's body isn't even cold in the ground." I felt a surge of anger, but I pushed it down. I didn't make excuses and say that it was Michael's child. I didn't want my baby to have such a grandmother and aunt. Instead, I smiled, a small, secretive smile that seemed to unnerve Karen even more. "My personal life is none of your concern," I said calmly. "Now, I think it's time for you to leave." Karen looked like she wanted to say more, but something in my expression must have stopped her. She turned on her heel, grabbing Emily's arm. I watched as they drove away, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I had stood my ground, protected my family, and maintained my dignity. Michael would have been proud. Growing up, our house was like a military camp. My father, a college teacher, ran a tight ship. My older sister Sarah was the perfect child, obedient, studious, and always eager to please. Me? I was the wild card, the one who always pushed the boundaries. "Carol, sit up straight," my father would bark during dinner. "A lady doesn't slouch." I'd roll my eyes and straighten my spine, only to slump down again the moment he looked away. It was a constant battle of wills. My mother, though less vocal, was equally strict. She'd purse her lips disapprovingly at my choice of clothes or friends. "What will the neighbors think?" was her constant refrain. Despite the suffocating atmosphere at home, I managed to carve out a bit of freedom for myself. I started dating Jake when I was 16. He was 19, in college, and everything my parents would disapprove of. We kept it secret, stealing moments together whenever we could. Life seemed to be looking up. I had plans to go to college, to finally escape the suffocating grip of my parents' expectations. But fate, it seems, had other plans. It was a few months after my 18th birthday when I started feeling sick in the mornings. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my upcoming exams. But as the days went by, a nagging suspicion began to grow. I still remember standing in the tiny bathroom of a gas station, staring at the little plastic stick in my trembling hands. 2 pink lines. Positive. I was pregnant. I spent the next few days and a daze, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I had to tell Jake, but every time I picked up the phone, my courage failed me. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer. We met at our usual spot, a small park hidden away from prying eyes. Jake was all smiles when he saw me, but his face fell as soon as he noticed my expression. "Carol, what's wrong?" he asked, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, wrapping my arms around myself. "I'm pregnant," I blurted out. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, and then fear. "Are you sure?" he finally managed to say. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I took 3 tests. They were all positive. Jake ran his hands through his hair, his eyes cold. "You need to get rid of it." "An abortion, Carol. It's the only way. We're too young for this. It would ruin both our lives." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was Jake, the boy I thought I loved, telling me to abort our child like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Get out of my sight," I hissed, turning away from him. He left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of the decision I now had to make. Telling my parents was even worse. I waited until after dinner, when my father was in his usual spot in the living room, reading the newspaper. My mother was knitting, and Sarah was there too, hovering in the background. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice shaking. My father lowered his newspaper, eyeing me suspiciously. "What is it, Carol?" I took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The explosion that followed was worse than I could have imagined. My father's face turned an alarming shade of red as he yelled about shame and disappointment. My mother burst into tears, wailing about what the neighbors would think. Sarah just stood there, her face a mask of shock and disgust. "You will get an abortion," my father declared once he'd calmed down enough to speak coherently. "We'll find a discreet clinic. No one needs to know about this mistake." Despite my initial reluctance, the constant pressure from my family wore me down. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a sterile doctor's office, my mother and Sarah flanking me like prison guards. The doctor, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, reviewed my charts with a frown. She looked up at me, her eyes full of concern. "Carol, I need to inform you of something important," she said gently. "Given your medical history and certain risk factors, if you proceed with an abortion, there's a high likelihood that you may never be able to have children again." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. never have children again? The choice suddenly became crystal clear. No, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. I'm not doing it. I'm keeping this baby. My mother gasped. Sarah rolled her eyes. But I stood firm. The drive home was tense and silent. As soon as we walked through the door, my father was there, expectant. Well, he demanded. She wouldn't do it, my mother spat. After everything we'd done for her. My father's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little, he cut himself off, taking a deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice was cold and final. Get out, he said. Pack your things and get out of this house. You're no daughter of mine. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your condition. My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes hard. You heard your father. Go. Sarah just stood there, silent and judgmental. Tears streaming down my face, I ran to my room and threw some clothes into a bag. As I headed for the door, my father's voice stopped me one last time. And don't think about coming back. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us. The door slammed behind me, the sound final and devastating. I was alone, pregnant, and homeless. In desperation, I called the only person I thought might help, my Aunt Linda. She and Uncle Bob had always been the black sheep of the family, living in another state and rarely speaking to my parents. Carol? What's wrong, sweetie? Aunt Linda's voice was warm and concerned. Through tears, I explained everything. There was a long pause after I finished. Where are you now? She finally asked. Outside our house. They kicked me out. Another pause. Stay right there. We're coming to get you. The drive to Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob's house was long, but it gave me time to process everything that had happened. Their house was modest but welcoming. As soon as we arrived, Aunt Linda went into full mother hen mode, fussing over me and insisting I eat something. Uncle Bob carried my bag to the spare room, which would now be my room. It's not much, he said, setting the bag down, but it's yours for as long as you need it. I looked around the small, cozy room and felt a lump in my throat. It's perfect, I whispered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, discussions about my future, and adjusting to my new life. We've been thinking, Aunt Linda said one evening over dinner. We want to help you continue your education. I looked up from my plate, surprised. What do you mean? Uncle Bob leaned forward. We've set aside some money over the years. We never had kids of our own, so we thought we'd use it to help you go to college. I was speechless. After everything that had happened, the idea of still being able to pursue my dreams seemed impossible. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Aunt Linda smiled. We believe in you, Carol. This baby doesn't have to mean the end of your dreams. And so, with their support, I enrolled in a local community college, majoring in business management. It wasn't easy, balancing classes with doctor's appointments and the increasing discomfort of pregnancy, but I was determined to make it work. I also found a job as a waitress at a local restaurant. The owner, a kind woman named Maria, was understanding about my situation and flexible with my hours. It wasn't much, but it allowed me to start saving for the baby and contribute a little to Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob's household. The day my son was born was the most terrifying and beautiful day of my life. After hours of labor, I held him in my arms, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob were there, beaming with pride like grandparents. What are you going to name him? Aunt Linda asked softly. I looked down at my son's face, so peaceful in sleep. Daniel, I said. It means God is my judge. Because no matter what anyone else thinks, I know I made the right choice. As I settled into motherhood, juggling a newborn with college classes and work, I often thought about my parents and Sarah. Had they heard about Daniel? Did they ever regret their decision? But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a new family now, one that accepted me and loved me unconditionally. One day, As I was scrolling through social media during a rare moment of downtime, a post caught my eye. It was from Sarah. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. Excited to announce that Jake and I are engaged. Can't wait to start our life together. The photo showed Sarah, beaming, her arm around Jake, the same Jake who had abandoned me and our child. They looked happy, carefree. Like nothing had ever happened. I felt a surge of emotions, anger, hurt, betrayal. But as I looked over at Daniel, peacefully playing in his crib, I realized something. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I had everything I needed right here. The years flew by in a blur of diapers, textbooks, and late-night study sessions. My last semester was particularly challenging. I was taking extra classes to graduate on time, still working at the restaurant, and chasing after an energetic 3-year-old. Graduation day was a whirlwind of emotions. As I stood in line, waiting to receive my diploma, I scanned the crowd. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob were there, of course, beaming with pride. Daniel sat on Uncle Bob's shoulders, waving excitedly every time he caught my eye. The real surprise came at the graduation party Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob threw for me. As we were celebrating, Maria, my boss from the restaurant, pulled me aside. "Carol, I have a proposition for you," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I'm looking for a new restaurant manager, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." I was stunned. "Me? But I've only ever been a waitress." Maria waved her hand dismissively. "You've been much more than that. I've seen how you handle difficult customers, how you organize the staff, how you balanced work and school and motherhood. That's the kind of dedication and skill I need in a manager." It was a dream come true. A stable job with better pay and regular hours, exactly what I needed for Daniel and me to start our new life. The next few years were a whirlwind of positive changes. I threw myself into my new role at the restaurant, learning everything I could about management and business operations. Daniel started school, growing into a bright, curious boy who loved to read and play baseball. It was at one of Daniel's Little League games that I met Tom. He was there with his son, Michael, who was on the opposing team. We struck up a conversation, and I was immediately drawn to his kind eyes and easy laugh. "Single dad?" I asked, noticing he was alone. He nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "Widower, actually. Michael's mom passed away when he was a baby." My heart went out to him. "I'm so sorry. It must be tough." "It is," he admitted. "But we manage. How about you? Single mom?" I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" Our relationship developed slowly. We were both cautious, having been hurt before and with our children to consider. But as the months passed, I found myself falling for Tom. He was kind, patient, and Daniel adored him. A year after we met, Tom proposed. It wasn't a grand, theatrical gesture, just a quiet moment in his backyard, with our boys playing nearby. Our wedding was small and intimate, just close friends and family. As I walked down the aisle, Daniel proudly by my side as the ring bearer, I caught Aunt Linda's eye. She was crying, but her smile was radiant. Life with Tom, Daniel, and Michael settled into a comfortable rhythm. And a couple of years after our wedding, we were blessed with another addition to our family. Our daughter, Emily, was born on a warm spring morning. As I held her in my arms, with Tom, Daniel, and Michael gathered around the hospital bed, I felt a sense of completeness I'd never experienced before. I loved all three of my children equally, Daniel and Emily, my biological children, and Michael, my stepson. They were all my kids, regardless of blood ties. One evening, as Aunt Linda was over helping with the kids, we were startled by a familiar voice coming from the TV. There, larger than life, were my parents. My father was standing at a podium, waving to a cheering crowd. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "John Williams announces candidacy for mayor." I felt my heart stop. It had been years since I'd seen my parents, even if only on a screen. My father looked older, his hair grayer, but his eyes still held that stern, determined look I remembered so well. As we watched him speak about family values and moral integrity, Aunt Linda's face contorted with anger. "Hypocrites," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. I turned to her, shocked by her outburst. "Aunt Linda?" She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the screen. "There's something you need to know, Carol. Something they've hidden for years." What she told me next shook me to my core. Many years ago, before Sarah and I were born, my parents had their first child, a boy. But he was born with severe physical defects, without legs. Instead of embracing their child, they left him at the hospital, afraid he would embarrass them. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, and a profound sadness for the brother I never knew. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I asked. Aunt Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Carol. I should have. But after what they did to you, I didn't want to add to your pain." That night, after the kids were in bed, I made a decision. I needed to find my brother. With Tom's support, I hired a private investigator. Weeks passed, and finally, we got a lead. My brother was alive, and against all odds, he had thrived. He was a successful writer, married with children of his own. He had been adopted by a wealthy family who had given him every opportunity to succeed in life. Meeting him for the first time was surreal. Despite his physical differences, I could see echoes of my own features in his face. His name was James, and he greeted me with a warm smile and open arms. "I always knew I had a biological family out there somewhere," he said, his voice gentle. "I just never expected to find a sister." Over the next few months, James and I grew close. I introduced him to my family, and he welcomed us into his. His wife, Sarah, a coincidence that made me laugh, and their 2 children became a part of our extended family. 20 years had passed since that fateful day when my parents kicked me out of their house. Life had moved on, bringing its share of joys and sorrows. My eldest, Daniel, was now 19 and had just started college on a baseball scholarship. I couldn't have been prouder of the young man he'd become. One lazy Sunday afternoon, as I was scrolling through news articles on my tablet, a familiar face caught my eye. It was my father, looking older but still carrying that air of self-importance I remembered so well. The headline read, "Mayor John Williams discusses family values in exclusive interview." Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the video. For a few minutes, I listened to my father espouse the importance of family, integrity, and moral values. And then, the interviewer asked about his children. My father's face softened into what I recognized as his public sympathy look. "I have one daughter, Sarah. She's the light of our lives. Tragically, we lost 2 of our children. The pain never really goes away, but it's made our family stronger." For days, I seethed with a quiet rage. How dare they? How dare they erase me, erase James, and paint themselves as tragic, sympathetic figures? Then, almost as if fate was intervening, James called. "Carol, guess what? I'm doing a book signing in our hometown next week. It would mean the world to me if you could come." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I told James, a plan already forming in my mind. The following week, I found myself back in the city of my childhood. As I walked the familiar streets, memories flooded back, some good, many painful. I pushed them aside, focusing on what I needed to do. The book signing was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. As I entered, I saw that James hadn't exaggerated, it seemed like half the town was there. Local celebrities, business leaders, and politicians all mingled, waiting for the event to begin. And there, in the front row, sat my parents and Sarah. My father, now the mayor, looked every inch the distinguished politician. My mother, elegantly dressed, smiled and nodded at acquaintances. Sarah was sitting next to them. They hadn't seen me yet. I took a seat near the back, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. James rolled onto the stage in a wheelchair, to enthusiastic applause. He looked confident, at ease in the spotlight. As he began to speak about his book and his life, I saw my parents nodding sympathetically. "I was born with a severe physical disability," James was saying. "No legs, and other health issues. My biological parents abandoned me at the hospital, unable or unwilling to care for a child with my needs." I watched my father's face carefully. He showed no sign of recognition, no hint of shame. Just the carefully crafted mask of a politician expressing appropriate concern for a constituent's sad story. James continued, "I was fortunate. I was adopted by a wonderful family who gave me every opportunity to succeed. But I always wondered about my birth family. Who were they? Why did they give me up?" The room was silent, all eyes fixed on James as he continued his story. I stood to the side, my heart racing, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Then, James smiled, his eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and determination. "But that's not the end of our story," he said. "You see, I found my family. My sister, Carol, is here with us today." He turned towards me, extending his hand. "Carol, would you join me on stage?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience as I stepped into the spotlight. I saw recognition dawn on many faces. After all, I had grown up in this town. But the most striking reactions came from the front row. My parents' faces drained of color, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning comprehension. Sarah, my sister, looked like she'd seen a ghost. They knew their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. My parents stood abruptly, clearly intending to make a hasty exit. But I wasn't about to let them escape the truth again. "Mom, Dad, please stay," I called out, my voice echoing through the now silent room. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation, don't you?" They froze, trapped by the eyes of the entire audience. Slowly, reluctantly, they sank back into their seats. I took a deep breath. "Many of you knew me growing up. You knew my family. But there's a lot you didn't know. A lot that's been hidden for far too long." And then, I told them everything. How my parents had abandoned James at the hospital, ashamed of his physical differences. How they'd hidden his existence, building their reputation on a foundation of lies. And then, history repeated itself, I continued, my voice growing stronger. When I got pregnant at 18, they didn't offer support or understanding. They demanded I have an abortion, ignoring the doctors who said it could leave me infertile. And when I refused, they kicked me out. Their own daughter, pregnant and alone, thrown away to protect their precious reputation. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw looks of disgust directed at my parents, who seemed to shrink in their seats. "For years, I've heard them talk about family values and morality," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But their actions tell a different story. They abandoned 2 of their children when we needed them most. They erased us from their lives to maintain their perfect image." The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some at my parents, others at each other. Journalists who had come to cover a simple book signing were now frantically taking notes or speaking rapidly into their phones. In the midst of the uproar, I locked eyes with my father. The man who had loomed so large in my childhood now looked small, defeated. My mother was openly weeping, while Sarah sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and confusion. In the days that followed, the story exploded. It was all over the local news, then national. My father's political career evaporated overnight. The man who had preached about integrity and family values was exposed as a hypocrite of the highest order. His position as mayor became untenable. He resigned within a week, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. The college where he had taught quickly distanced themselves, terminating his position. Amidst all the chaos, one thing became clear: my sister Sarah had made her choice. She stood firmly by our parents, refusing to acknowledge the truth of what they had done. "You've ruined everything," she hissed during a brief phone call. "Don't contact me again. You're dead to me, just like you're dead to Mom and Dad." But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few days later, I received a call from a number I hadn't seen in over 20 years. It was Jake, Sarah's husband, and the father of my eldest son. "Carol?" His voice was hesitant, almost sheepish. "I've been thinking about us. About what happened. Sarah and we can't have children. And I thought, maybe we have a son together. We could be a family." I couldn't help but laugh. "Jake, you made your choice 20 years ago. You abandoned me when I was pregnant with your child. You married my sister. And now, just because you can't have children with her, you think you can come back to me? No, that's not how this works." "But Carol." "No, Jake. I have a wonderful husband and a beautiful family. I don't need you, and I certainly don't want you. Goodbye." I hung up, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. However, the surprises weren't over. The next day, I received another unexpected call. This time, it was from Jake's parents. "Carol?" a tentative voice asked. "This is Martha, Jake's mother. We just found out about Daniel." "Is it true? Do we have a grandson?" The conversation that followed was emotional and eye-opening. It turned out that Jake and my parents had told them I'd had an abortion and run away from home. They'd spent years believing their grandchild never existed. "We'd like to meet him," Martha said, her voice trembling. "If that's okay with you, of course. We understand if you don't want us in your lives." I thought about it for a moment. These people weren't responsible for Jake's actions or my parents' lies. They were victims of the deception too. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll talk to Daniel and see if he's open to meeting you." The meeting between Daniel and his paternal grandparents went surprisingly well. There were tears, hugs, and a lot of catching up to do. Daniel, always compassionate, welcomed them with open arms. In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. James and his family became regular fixtures in our lives, filling our home with laughter and love. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob doted on all the grandchildren, biological or not. As for my parents and Sarah, I heard snippets of news now and then. They'd moved away, trying to escape the scandal. Part of me felt sorry for them, but I knew I'd done the right thing in telling the truth. My name is Julia, and I never imagined my life would turn out like this. I grew up in a pretty normal family, well, normal for us anyway. My dad was always busy with his window frame business, and my mom took care of the house. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Dad rarely talked about work at home. He'd come in late, give Mom a quick kiss, and ask me how school was. That was about it. I didn't mind though. I was happy in my own little world. I remember the day everything changed. I was 22, fresh out of college and trying to figure out what to do with my life. I overheard Dad on the phone, his voice tense. "No, absolutely not. I won't let you take over my company. I've worked too hard for this," he said. I shouldn't have eavesdropped, but I couldn't help it. My stomach twisted as I listened. Dad's company was in trouble? Why hadn't he said anything? That night at dinner, I watched him closely. He seemed normal, joking with Mom about her overcooked pot roast. But I saw the worry lines around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. I had to do something. But what? I didn't know the first thing about business. Still, I couldn't just sit back and watch my family's livelihood get destroyed. The next day, I did some digging. It wasn't hard to find out who was trying to take over Dad's company. Big shot businessman named Robert Caldwell. His office wasn't far from our house. The receptionist looked at me like I was crazy when I asked to see Mr. Caldwell. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, eyebrow raised. "No, but it's important. Please, just 5 minutes," I begged. She must have taken pity on me, because after a phone call, she waved me towards the elevator. "Top floor," she said. The ride up felt like it took forever. When the doors opened, I was face to face with Robert Caldwell himself. He was older than I expected, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. Well, he said, looking me up and down. What do we have here? I swallowed hard. Mr. Caldwell, I'm Julia Thompson. I'm here about my father's company, Thompson Windows. His eyebrows shot up. Thompson's daughter? This is unexpected. Come in, let's talk. I followed him into his office, trying not to gape at the view. He settled behind his massive desk and gestured for me to sit. So, Miss Thompson, what can I do for you? I took a deep breath. Please don't take over my father's company. It means everything to him. There must be another way. Caldwell leaned back, studying me. Interesting. I have a proposition for you, Miss Thompson. I'll leave your father's company alone, if you agree to marry my son. I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. Excuse me? You heard me. Marry my son, make him grow up a little. Do that, and your father's company is safe. I left Caldwell's office in a daze. Marry his son? Was he insane? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't have much choice. It was either this or watch my father's life's work crumble. The next day, I found myself back in that intimidating office. Caldwell was waiting, a smug smile on his face. So, Miss Thompson, have you made your decision? I took a deep breath. Yes, I'll do it. I'll marry your son. Caldwell clapped his hands together. Excellent. Let's introduce you two, shall we? Before I knew it, I was being ushered into another room. And there he was, Caldwell's son. I'd expected some stuffy businessman type, but the man who stood up to greet me was anything but. He was tall, with messy dark hair and a crooked smile. Hey, he said, extending his hand. I'm Jack. You must be Julia? I shook his hand, trying not to show my surprise. Yeah, that's me. Jack's father cleared his throat. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. As soon as the door closed behind him, Jack's casual demeanor vanished. He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. Look, I'm sorry about this. My dad, he's got some pretty old-fashioned ideas. I shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant. It's fine. We're both adults, right? We can handle this. Jack laughed, but it sounded forced. Yeah, sure. Just a casual arranged marriage. No big deal. We spent the next hour talking, and I hate to admit it, but Jack was kind of interesting. He was smart and funny, even if he did seem a bit irresponsible. I could see why his father wanted him to grow up. Over the next few weeks, Jack and I started dating, if you could call it that. We went out to dinners, movies, the usual stuff. But there was always this undercurrent of awkwardness. We both knew this wasn't real, no matter how much we pretended. And so, 6 months after that fateful meeting in Caldwell's office, I found myself walking down the aisle. My dad looked so proud, so happy. He had no idea of the deal I'd made to save his company. As I said my vows, I looked into Jack's eyes. There was no love there, not really. But there was friendship, and maybe that could be enough. The reception was a blur of congratulations and champagne. Jack's mother, Elizabeth, cornered me at one point, her smile tight. Welcome to the family, dear, she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. I do hope you'll make Jack happy. I plastered on my best fake smile. I'll certainly try, Mrs. Caldwell. As we left for our honeymoon, I caught a glimpse of my father-in-law. He was beaming, clearly pleased with himself. I felt a flash of anger. This was all just a game to him. The first few years of our marriage were interesting, to say the least. Jack and I settled into a routine of sorts. We lived in a nice house, courtesy of his father's wealth, but it felt more like we were roommates than husband and wife. I tried my best to be a good influence on Jack. Slowly but surely, I saw changes in him. He started spending less time with his party-loving friends and more time at the office with his father. I could see the pride in his father's eyes when Jack started showing real interest in the business. It made me feel like maybe this whole arrangement wasn't for nothing. Jack's mother, on the other hand, was a different story. She never outright said anything, but I could feel her disapproval radiating off her in waves. The way she'd purse her lips when I spoke, or the backhanded compliments she'd give. "Oh, Julia, that dress is interesting. So brave of you to wear something like that." I'd grit my teeth and smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." Despite the challenges, I held on to hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jack and I could grow to love each other. Maybe when we had kids, things would change. But life had other plans. It was a crisp fall day when we got the news. Jack and I sat in the doctor's office, the silence heavy between us. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "But the tests show that you, Mr. Caldwell, are unable to father children." The words hit me like a physical blow. No children. The one thing I'd been counting on to bring us closer, to make this marriage real, was now impossible. That night, as I lay awake, I thought about my own parents. Dad's business had flourished since my marriage to Jack. He'd even managed to double his turnover. I was happy for him, truly. But I couldn't help feeling a bit lost. I wanted to work, to have a purpose beyond being Jack's wife. But when I brought it up to him, his response was swift and firm. "Work? Why would you need to work? We have more than enough money." "It's not about the money, Jack. I want to do something meaningful." He shook his head. "In our circle, wives don't work. They do charity. Why don't you start a foundation or something?" And so, the Julia Caldwell Foundation for Children with Cancer was born. It wasn't what I'd imagined for myself, but it gave me purpose. I threw myself into the work, organizing fundraisers, visiting hospitals, doing whatever I could to help. Jack didn't seem to care much about my new passion. In fact, he didn't seem to care much about anything I did these days. We were living parallel lives, inhabiting the same space, but rarely intersecting. Years passed. 10, to be exact. And then, everything changed again. Jack's father died suddenly of a heart attack. Just like that, Jack was thrust into the role of CEO. I tried to be supportive, but I could see him struggling under the weight of his new responsibilities. 2 years after that, we got more bad news. Jack's mother had cancer. "We should move her to a care facility," Jack said, his voice detached. "They can take better care of her there." But his mother refused. "I will die in my own home," she declared, her chin lifted defiantly. And so, drawing on my years of experience with the Cancer Foundation, I took charge of her care. I hired nurses, coordinated treatments, and spent hours by her bedside. To my surprise, Elizabeth's attitude towards me began to soften. One day, as I was adjusting her pillows, she caught my hand. "You're a good woman, Julia," she said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I felt tears prick my eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." 5 years passed since Jack took over his father's company. I wish I could say things improved, but the truth was far from it. Jack's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was drinking more, coming home at odd hours, and snapping at me for the smallest things. One day, I received a call from Jack's assistant. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mr. Caldwell hasn't been to the office in days. Is everything all right?" When he finally stumbled home that night, reeking of alcohol, I confronted him. "Jack, what's happening?" "Your assistant called." "You haven't been to work?" He laughed bitterly. "Work? What's the point? The company's going under anyway. Dear old Dad left me a sinking ship, and I couldn't keep it afloat." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All those years of hard work, gone? And Jack seemed almost relieved? Desperate to salvage something, I reached out to my father. Despite being semi-retired, he agreed to help. He offered Jack a position as his deputy, hoping to mentor him back to success. But Jack's heart wasn't in it. He showed up late, left early, and generally did the bare minimum. I watched helplessly as my father's sales figures began to drop. I knew I had to have a serious talk with Jack. One night, after he'd had a few drinks, as usual, I approached him. "Jack, we need to talk about work. You're barely showing up. My father's company is suffering because of you." Jack's face contorted with anger. "Oh, so now it's my fault? I never wanted this, Jules. Any of it. What are you talking about?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This life. This marriage. I'm just waiting for Mom to kick the bucket so I can sell her house and get out of here." I stared at him, horrified. "How can you say that? Your mother is dying, and all you care about is her money? Don't act all high and mighty," he spat. "We both know this marriage is a sham. You're just as eager to get out as I am." Disgusted, I turned to leave the room. As I opened the door, I came face to face with Jack's mother. The look on her face told me she'd heard everything. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, silently, she reached out and squeezed my hand. In that gesture, I felt her gratitude, her understanding, and her sorrow. The day I got the call about my parents' plane crash, my world shattered. Mom and Dad, gone in an instant. Their small plane to Hawaii, meant to be a second honeymoon, became their final journey. I needed support, someone to lean on. But Jack? He was nowhere to be found. My own husband couldn't even be bothered to show up to the funeral. As I stood there, watching my parents' caskets lowered into the ground, I felt more alone than ever. After the funeral, anger began to replace my sorrow. How dare he? How could he abandon me when I needed him most? With this newfound fury fueling me, I marched into Dad's company, our company now, I supposed. The sight that greeted me when I entered Dad's old office made my blood boil. There was Jack, lounging in Dad's chair like he owned the place, barking orders like some conquering hero. "Jack," I said, my voice tight with barely contained rage. "We need to talk." He looked up, his face a mask of annoyance. "What is it now, Jules? Can't you see I'm busy?" "Busy?" I spat. "You couldn't even be busy enough to come to my parents' funeral." Jack rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go with the moralizing again. You know what, Jules? Always nagging, always pushing. Well, I'm done with it. And I'm done with you." I stared at him, shocked. Then I saw something change in his eyes. A cold, calculating look replaced the anger. "You know, Jules," he said, his voice suddenly calm, "this company? It's worth about $17 million. And guess what? As deputy director, it's all mine now." My heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" He leaned back in the chair, Dad's chair, with a smug smile. "I'm the deputy director. I have all the passwords, access to all the accounts. I'm in charge now, and there's nothing you can do about it." "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "You've already run your father's company into the ground. I won't let you do the same to my father's legacy." Jack laughed, a cold, harsh sound. "Oh, I'm not going to run it. I'm going to sell it, piece by piece. And then I'm going to live like a king." Before I could stop him, he turned to the computer. I watched in horror as he transferred a large sum from the company account to his personal one. "There," he said, turning back to me. "That should keep me comfortable for a while." Then, as if this whole thing was just a minor inconvenience, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. He tossed them at me casually. "Oh, and here, divorce papers. I think it's time we ended this farce, don't you?" I caught the papers reflexively, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It was too much, too fast. My parents dead, my marriage over, my father's company being stolen right in front of me. I left the office in a daze, divorce papers clutched in my hand. But as I walked, something inside me shifted. I'd spent years bending to Jack's will, to his father's manipulations. No more. It was time to fight back. With renewed determination, I headed straight to my father's lawyer's office. Mr. Henderson had been Dad's friend and confidant for years. If anyone could help me, it would be him. "Julia," Mr. Henderson said, rising to greet me as I entered his office. "I'm so sorry about your parents. How are you holding up?" I collapsed into the chair across from him, the events of the day spilling out in a rush. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "Julia, I think it's time I shared something with you. Your father's will. He made some changes just before the accident." As he read the will, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The company, it was mine. All mine. Dad had left it to me, not Jack. But there was more. Mr. Henderson looked up from the papers, his eyes twinkling. "There's something else you should know. Your father dismissed Jack 2 weeks before his death. Fired him outright." I couldn't help it, I laughed. A real, genuine laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. So all those orders Jack was giving. Completely meaningless, Mr. Henderson confirmed. Then he pulled out an envelope. "There's one more thing. A letter from your father." With shaking hands, I opened it. Dad's familiar handwriting blurred as tears filled my eyes. "My dearest Julia," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry for leaving you like this, but I hope I've left you with the tools to build the life you deserve. The company is yours now. And Jules? It's time to let go of Jack. You've given enough of yourself to that marriage. It's time to live for you. I love you, sweetheart. Make me proud." I looked up at Mr. Henderson, wiping my eyes. "Do you have a pen?" Without a word, he handed me one. I signed the divorce papers Jack had given me, feeling lighter with each stroke of the pen. "Can you file these?" I asked, handing them back. "I want this done as quickly as possible." Mr. Henderson nodded. "Consider it done." As I left his office, I felt free. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, I was in control of my own life. No more Jack, no more Caldwell's pulling my strings. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, my best friend from the charity foundation. "Sarah? It's Julia. Want to meet for coffee? I've got some news." An hour later, we were seated in our favorite cafe, lattes in hand. "So," Sarah said, eyeing me curiously. "What's this big news?" I took a deep breath, then let it all out. Jack, the company, the divorce. Sarah listened, her eyes widening. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Girl, you're free. And now you're the boss." I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "I don't know, Sarah. Can I really run a company?" She fixed me with a stern look. "Are you kidding me? Julia, you've been running that charity foundation like a pro for years. You're smart, you're organized, and you actually care about people. You're going to be an amazing CEO." After my talk with Sarah, I felt invigorated. It was time to face the music and get my things from Jack's house. I never really thought of it as my home, and now I knew why. I found my mother-in-law, Elizabeth, in the living room. Her face was drawn, tired from her ongoing battle with cancer. "Elizabeth," I said gently, "I'm here to get my things. Jack and I, we're getting divorced." To my surprise, her eyes filled with tears. "Julia, I know I haven't always been kind to you. But you've been so good to me. Would you consider taking me with you?" I was stunned. "You want to come with me?" Before she could answer, the front door slammed open. Jack stormed in, his face red with fury. "You," he shouted, pointing at me. "What the hell did you do?" "The company accounts are blocked. I can't access the money." I straightened my spine, looking him dead in the eye. "That money isn't yours, Jack. It never was. Oh, and by the way, my father fired you 2 weeks ago. You have no claim to the company. I've already instructed security not to let you in the building. Jack's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Then his gaze shifted, noticing his mother packing a suitcase. Mom, what are you doing? Elizabeth looked at her son, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. I'm going with Julia. I'm sorry, Jack, but you've proven to be unreliable. Jack's face turned an even deeper shade of red. Unreliable? Me? This is all your fault. You raised me to be this way. You and your coddling and your expectations. He turned to me, his voice dripping with venom. Fine, get out. Both of you. I don't need either of you. I felt a wave of pity for him. This angry, bitter man was a far cry from the charming, if irresponsible, guy I'd married. But I couldn't let that sway me. Not anymore. Come on, Elizabeth, I said softly. Let's get your things. As we packed, Jack continued to rant and rave, hurling insults and blame. But we tuned him out, focusing on the task at hand. The drive to my parents' house was quiet. Elizabeth dozed in the passenger seat, the stress of the day taking its toll. As we pulled up to the house, a lump formed in my throat. It felt strange coming here without Mom and Dad. We're here, I said softly, gently waking Elizabeth. I helped her inside, leading her to my parents' room. It felt right, somehow, to give her this space. Are you sure? Elizabeth asked, her eyes wide as she took in the room. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. Yes. I think they would have wanted it this way. As I helped Elizabeth settle in, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for my parents, relief at being free from Jack, uncertainty about the future. But underneath it all, there was a glimmer of hope. Taking over Dad's company was like diving into the deep end of a pool without knowing how to swim. Those first few months were a whirlwind of meetings, financial reports, and sleepless nights. But I was determined to make it work. I hired Tom, a brilliant business consultant, as my right-hand man. He patiently guided me through the intricacies of running a multi-million-dollar company. You've got good instincts, Julia, he'd say. Trust them. Slowly but surely, I found my footing. 6 months in, I wasn't just treading water, I was swimming laps. The company's performance began to improve, and I felt a surge of pride knowing Dad would have been pleased. Through it all, I never neglected the Cancer Foundation. If anything, my work there became even more important to me. It was a link to my past and a beacon for my future. Elizabeth's condition worsened over time. I threw myself into her care, determined to make her final days as comfortable as possible. We grew close during those 2 years, healing old wounds and forming a bond one never thought possible. The day she passed, I held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Elizabeth." She squeezed my hand weakly, a small smile on her face, before slipping away peacefully. I organized the funeral myself, making sure everything was perfect. Jack didn't show up. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung to see how far he'd fallen. A few weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Mr. Henderson. "Julia, there's something you need to see. Can you come to my office?" When I arrived, I was shocked to see Jack there, a young blonde hanging off his arm. He smirked at me. "Well, if it isn't the little CEO. Don't worry, I'm just here to collect my inheritance. Mom and I might have had our differences, but blood is thicker than water, right?" I bit my tongue, waiting for Mr. Henderson to speak. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading Elizabeth's will. As he spoke, I watched Jack's smug expression morph into disbelief, then fury. "And so, I leave my house and all my savings to Julia Thompson, with the stipulation that the money be donated to the Cancer Foundation she so passionately supports." Tears sprang to my eyes. Elizabeth's final act of kindness overwhelmed me. Jack exploded. "This is bullshit. She manipulated Mom. She's a fraud, a gold digger. She ruined my life, and now she's stealing my inheritance." His girlfriend, looking bewildered, stepped away from him. You said we'd be set for life with this money. I'm out of here. She stormed out, leaving Jack sputtering. As I left the office, I heard Jack's continued ranting fade behind me. I felt light, free. Elizabeth's gift wasn't just about the money, it was validation. She had seen me, truly seen me, and found me worthy. You know how sometimes one little thing can change everything? Well, that's exactly what happened to me, Alice, just 2 weeks before my engagement party. I'm 27, and I was over the moon about marrying Tom, my boyfriend of 3 years. We'd been planning this shindig for months, and everything was falling into place. Then, bam, my mom called. Alice, cancel the engagement party, she barked into the phone. I nearly dropped my cell. What? Mom, are you kidding me? No jokes here. Emily just got promoted, and we're celebrating on your engagement day. Emily's my little sister, 3 years younger, and always been Mom and Dad's golden girl. But this? This was a whole new level of crazy. Mom, come on. I've been planning this for ages. I'm not canceling because Emily got a pat on the back at work, I said, trying not to lose it. Don't be selfish, Alice. This is big for your sister. Same guests, different party. Just reschedule. I felt my blood boiling. No way, Mom. This is my engagement we're talking about. I'm not canceling. End of story. She started screeching then, her voice so high it made me wince. I didn't even bother listening. I just hung up. Sitting there, staring at my phone, all these childhood memories came flooding back. It was always like this, Emily first, me, whenever. I remembered my sweet 16. Mom and Dad totally forgot until Grandma called to wish me happy birthday. They scrambled to throw together some lame celebration, a grocery store cake and a gift card. Talk about pathetic, especially compared to the 3-day bash they'd thrown for Emily's 13th just a few months earlier. That's when Tom walked in. One look at my face and he knew something was up. Alice, what's wrong? He asked, plopping down next to me. I spilled everything, the call, Mom's demands, the memories. He listened, his face getting darker with every word. That's bull, he said when I finished. We're not canceling anything. I nodded, so grateful for his support. I know. It's just, why can't they ever put me first? Just once. Because they're idiots, Tom said firmly. But I put you first. Always. I looked up at him, managing a small smile. I know. That's why I'm marrying you, dummy. We spent the rest of the night going over our plans, making sure everything was perfect. As I drifted off to sleep, I tried to push thoughts of my family out of my head. This was my time, my moment. I wasn't going to let them mess it up. The next morning, I woke up determined to forget about Mom's crazy call and focus on the party. I had a million things to do, invites to send, decorations to sort out, you name it. Then my phone pinged. It was my cousin Rachel. Hey Alice, everything okay with you and Tom? Heard you guys split up. I stared at my phone, totally confused. Where'd she get that idea? I typed back quick. What? No way. We're fine. Who told you that? Rachel's reply popped up. Weird. Aunt Linda said your mom told her the engagement was off. My stomach dropped like a stone. I called Rachel right away. What's going on? I asked as soon as she picked up. I don't know, Alice. Aunt Linda called last night. Said your mom told her you and Tom had this huge fight and called everything off. She said we should all go to Emily's promotion party instead. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Rachel, that's all lies. We're still engaged, the party's still on. Mom wanted me to cancel for Emily's thing, but I said no way. There was a pause. Oh, crap. Alice, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I spent the next hour on the phone with Rachel, piecing together what happened. Turns out, my mom had gone behind my back to cancel my engagement party. She'd called every single relative on the guest list, spinning this wild story about Tom and me breaking up, and redirected them all to Emily's promotion party. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I'm gonna fix this mess. Can you help spread the word that the engagement's still on? Of course, Rachel replied without missing a beat. I'll start calling people right now. After hanging up, I just sat on my couch, trying to wrap my head around it all. My own mother had tried to sabotage my engagement party. It was almost too crazy to believe. Tom found me there an hour later when he got home from work. One look at my face and he knew something was up. I told him everything, Mom's calls, the lies, the whole Emily party redirect. With each word, I could see the anger building in his eyes. That's it, he said when I finished. We're cutting them off. All of them. Your parents, Emily, the whole bunch. I knew he was right, but the thought of cutting off my family scared me. Who would I be without them? Even if they treated me like dirt, they were still my family. Let's focus on fixing this first, I said. We need to let everyone know the engagement's still on. Tom nodded, his jaw set. Okay, where do we start? We spent the rest of the night in damage control mode, sending emails, making calls, posting on social media. I wrote this long message explaining everything and sent it to everyone on our guest list. It was exhausting and humiliating, having to explain over and over that no, Tom and I hadn't broken up, and yes, the engagement party was still happening. By the time we finished, it was way past midnight. My voice was shot from all the talking, and my eyes burned from staring at screens. We did it, Tom said, pulling me into a hug. It's gonna be okay. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Mom's betrayal had opened up old wounds. All the times I'd been overlooked, all the times Emily had been the favorite, it all came rushing back. The next day, I decided to visit Aunt Marge. She's Dad's sister and has always been pretty nice to me. I figured I'd invite her to the engagement party in person and clear up any confusion. When I got to her place, I heard voices coming from the living room. I was about to shout hello when I caught a snippet of conversation that made me freeze. Can't believe Alice would do such a thing, Aunt Marge was saying. Canceling her own engagement party to spite her sister. So childish. My heart sank. It was a new lie from my family, voiced in order to interrupt the previous fake. I was about to storm in and set things straight when another voice chimed in. I know, right? Poor Emily must be crushed. After all that hard work to get promoted, and now Alice is trying to steal her thunder. I recognized that voice, it was my cousin Sarah. I always thought we were close, but there she was, gossiping about me behind my back. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped into the room. Is that what you really think of me? Both women jumped like they'd seen a ghost. Aunt Marge recovered first, plastering on a fake smile. Alice, sweetie, we didn't hear you come in. Obviously, I said, my voice ice cold. I came to invite you to my engagement party, but seems like you've already made up your minds about me. Sarah at least had the decency to look ashamed. Alice, we didn't mean. Save it, I cut her off. I want to know exactly what Mom told you. For the next hour, I listened as they spilled the beans on Mom's tall tale. According to her, I threw a fit when I heard about Emily's promotion, demanding she reschedule her celebration. When Emily said no, I supposedly canceled my own engagement party out of spite, saying I'd rather not get married at all than share the spotlight. It was something new, a new lie from my family. By the time they finished, I was shaking with anger. None of that is true, I said, my voice trembling. Mom called me and demanded I cancel my engagement party for Emily's celebration. I said no, and now she's spreading lies to sabotage me. I told them everything, the forgotten birthdays, the constant comparisons, years of feeling like I was never good enough. By the time I finished, both women were in tears. Oh, Alice, Aunt Marge said, reaching for my hand. We had no idea. We should have known better than to believe such crazy stories. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Look, I appreciate the apology. But right now, I need your help. The engagement party is still on, and I need you to spread the word. Can you do that? They both nodded eagerly, looking relieved to have a chance to make things right. As I left Aunt Marge's house, I felt all mixed up, angry at Mom's betrayal, hurt that my family so easily believed the worst about me, but also a tiny bit hopeful. At least some of the truth was out now. The big day arrived, and boy, was I a bundle of nerves as Tom and I walked up to the hall. I held my breath as we pushed open the doors, bracing myself for whatever mess we might find inside. Holy cow! I couldn't believe my eyes. The place was buzzing with people. Smiling faces turned to greet us, and this warm, fuzzy feeling washed over me. The room was packed with relatives, not just the ones we'd managed to reach yesterday, but faces I hadn't seen in ages. I can't believe you all came, I said, my voice all choked up. Uncle Joe, Dad's brother, came up and gave Tom a hearty slap on the back. Of course we came. Did you really think we'd miss this? Though I gotta say, those rumors about your cancelled engagement sure spread like wildfire. Looks like they backfired big time. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Guess they did. As Tom and I made our way through the crowd, soaking up all the congrats and well wishes, I couldn't help but notice Mom, Dad, and Emily were nowhere to be seen. No texts, no emails, not even a grudging congrats. But surprisingly, their absence felt more like a relief than a letdown. Instead, I found myself gravitating towards Tom's parents, who were beaming at us with genuine pride and love. His mom hugged me tight, whispering, "We're so proud of you, Alice. You're already part of our family." The party was in full swing when suddenly, there was a commotion near the dance floor. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was my 80-year-old grandma in the middle, showing off what she called an incendiary dance of her youth. "Come on, you young uns," she called out, eyes twinkling mischievously. "Let me show you how we used to cut a rug back in my day." The crowd went wild as Grandma twirled and swayed, moving surprisingly well for her age. Soon, others joined in, and the dance floor turned into this amazing multi-generational dance-off. As I mingled with the guests, I couldn't help but overhear bits of gossip about all the family drama leading up to today. Can you believe what Alice's mother tried to pull? I heard cousin Sarah say to another relative. Trying to cancel her own daughter's engagement party for her other daughter's work thing? It's nuts. I know, the other voice replied. Poor Alice has always gotten the short end of the stick in that family. I'm glad she's finally standing up for herself. Instead of feeling embarrassed or upset by these chats, I felt validated. For once, my relatives were seeing the truth about my family dynamics, and they were on my side. As the night went on, I found myself feeling truly happy and celebrated, maybe for the first time ever. The absence of my immediate family, which I'd been so worried about, instead felt like this huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The day after our kick-ass engagement party, Tom and I were chilling on the couch, reliving the awesome moments from last night when my phone rang. My stomach did a flip when I saw it was Mom calling. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello? You ungrateful, nasty girl." Mom's voice screeched through the speaker. "How dare you?" I held the phone away from my ear, her angry rant clear even at arm's length. Tom looked at me, worried, but I shook my head, signaling I'd handle it. "Mom, what?" "Don't you mom me," she cut me off. "You've humiliated your sister." Only 3 people showed up to her party. 3. And they were just those nosy old aunts who'd show up to the opening of an envelope. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "I'm sorry you're disappointed, but..." "Disappointed?" "Emily is crushed. She cried all night. This was supposed to be her moment, and you ruined it with your selfishness." I felt my patience wearing thin. "Mom, I've been planning my engagement party for months. Emily's promotion party was a last-minute thing, and she knew it clashed with my engagement. That's no excuse. Family comes first, Alice. But clearly, you wouldn't know anything about that. Before I could respond, she hung up on me. Immediately after the call, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Emily. Hope you're happy. You've ruined everything. I'll make you pay for this humiliation. I showed the message to Tom, who frowned. She can't be serious. The next 2 weeks were quiet, and I started to think maybe the storm had blown over. But then, one afternoon, there was a surprise knock at our door. I opened it to find Tom's parents standing there, looking worried. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, what a surprise. Is everything okay? They exchanged a glance before Mrs. Thompson spoke. Alice, dear, can we come in? We need to talk to you about something. My heart sank as I showed them to the living room. Once we were all seated, Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. Alice, we've heard some troubling rumors. There's been talk that you've been cheating on Tom. I felt like I'd been slapped. What? That's ridiculous. I would never. We know, dear, Mrs. Thompson interrupted gently. We've known you for years. We don't believe it for a second. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by anger as I realized where these rumors probably came from. It's my sister, I said, my voice shaking a bit. She threatened to get back at me for ruining her promotion party. She must be spreading these lies. Mr. Thompson nodded grimly. We figured as much. We wanted to come to you directly rather than let these rumors spread. As they left, promising to help squash any rumors they heard, I felt all mixed up inside. I was touched by the Thompsons' support and trust in me, but I was also furious at Emily. How could she stoop so low? A few days after the drama with Tom's parents, I got a call from Grandma. Her voice, usually so cheery, sounded worried. Alice, sweetie, she started. I've heard about all this mess with your parents and Emily. Don't you think it's time to bury the hatchet? I sighed, feeling the weight of her expectations. Grandma, it's not that easy. They've really hurt me. I know, honey, but they're family. Surely there's a way to patch things up. I could hear the plea in her voice, and it tugged at my heartstrings. Grandma had always been there for me, even when the rest of my family wasn't. I hated disappointing her. What do you think I should do? I asked, already dreading the answer. Why don't you try reaching out? Make a peace offering. Show them you're willing to mend fences. I closed my eyes, torn between my love for Grandma and my need to protect myself. After a long moment, I sighed. Okay, Grandma. I'll try. For you. That evening, I stood on my parents' doorstep, heart pounding. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew this wasn't going to go well. Emily was there, her face like thunder. So, she spat, you think you can just waltz in here and throw me a pity party? That's not what I started, but she cut me off. I don't need your handouts, Alice. Do you think that makes up for what you did? I should have had my party on your day. Then people would have actually shown up. I stared at her, shocked by the venom in her voice. Emily, I'm trying to make things right. Make things right, she screeched. You ruined everything. As usual, it's all about you. I looked to my parents, hoping for some support, but they just stood there, nodding along with Emily's tirade. She's right, Alice, Mom said. You've always been so selfish. I felt something snap inside me. Without a word, I turned and walked out, ignoring their calls behind me. I visited my grandma again. She greeted me with a hopeful smile. How did it go, dear? Instead of answering, I pulled out my phone. I recorded the conversation, Grandma. I think you need to hear this. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded. I hit play, and Emily's furious voice filled the room. As the recording played, I watched Grandma's face change from hope to shock, then to deep disappointment. When it finished, there was a long silence. Then, to my surprise, Grandma reached out and took my hand. Oh, Alice, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was this bad. I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have pushed you to reconcile. I felt tears prick my eyes. It's okay, Grandma. You didn't know. She shook her head. No, it's not okay. I should have believed you from the start. I wanted so badly for our family to be whole. We sat in silence for a while, both processing what had happened. Finally, Grandma spoke again. Alice, dear, I want you to know something. Family isn't just about blood. It's about love, respect, and support. And from what I've seen and heard, Tom and his family give you that. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing your own happiness. The morning after my heart-to-heart with Grandma, I woke up to my phone buzzing like crazy. It was a barrage of angry texts from my parents. My heart sank as I read them, realizing Grandma must have spilled the beans about the recording. How dare you record our private conversations? Mom's message screamed. You're nothing but a sneaky, ungrateful snitch. Dad's message wasn't any better. I can't believe you'd stoop so low as to secretly record us and then play it for your grandmother. You betrayed this family for the last time. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Even when faced with proof of their own nasty behavior, they still found a way to make me the bad guy. This latest betrayal was the last straw. I was done with my toxic family. In the weeks that followed, I tried to focus on work and my life with Tom. But Emily, it seemed, had other plans. Her vindictiveness went into overdrive as she launched a full-on harassment campaign against me. It started with whispers at work. Colleagues would suddenly clam up when I walked into a room, only to start whispering again the moment I left. I soon found out Emily had been spreading nasty rumors about me, everything from calling me incompetent to telling outright lies about my personal life. Then came the anonymous messages on social media. Hateful comments popped up on my posts, each one nastier than the last. I couldn't prove it was Emily, but the tone and content left little doubt in my mind. But Emily's cruelty hit a new low when she tried to contact Tom. One evening, he came home looking troubled. Alice, I got a weird call today, he said. It was Emily. She tried to tell me you were cheating on me. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? Tom, you know that's not true. He quickly reassured me. Of course I know that. I shut her down right away. But Alice, this is getting out of hand. I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion. I know. I just don't know how to make it stop. As it turned out, I didn't have to do anything. Emily's obsession with revenge started to bite her in the butt. Her work started to suffer as she spent more and more time plotting against me. Her colleagues noticed her weird behavior, the constant whispering, the long stretches spent on her phone instead of working. It wasn't long before her bosses took notice. I heard through the office grapevine that Emily had gotten an official warning for her declining performance. But even that didn't seem to stop her. Then, about a month into her harassment campaign, the news broke. Emily had been demoted. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very promotion she'd been so desperate to celebrate, the one that had kicked off this whole ugly mess, was now gone. After all the Emily drama died down, I threw myself into wedding planning like it was my job. We finally picked this gorgeous outdoor spot. Picture a fairy tale garden with this cute little gazebo where we'd say our I dos. As we stood there, imagining our big day, Tom gave my hand a squeeze. You happy? He asked softly. I looked up at him, feeling all warm and fuzzy inside. Happier than I've ever been, I replied, and I meant it. With the venue locked down, we moved on to picking our wedding squad. I asked my ride-or-die friends, the ones who'd stuck by me through all the craziness, to be my bridesmaids. They all said yes, which was awesome. Then came the invite list. I sat at our dining table, addressing envelopes to all the relatives and friends who'd had our backs during the past few crazy months. As I wrote each name, I felt this wave of gratitude for these people who'd shown me what real family was all about. But when I got to the bottom of my list, I paused. There were 3 names I hadn't written: Mom, Dad, and Emily. I stared at those blank spaces, feeling all kinds of emotions swirling inside me. Tom found me there, staring at the paper. "You okay?" he asked, putting a comforting hand on my shoulder. I looked up at him, tears in my eyes. "I don't think I can invite them, Tom. After everything that's happened." He nodded, understanding. "It's your call, Alice. Whatever you decide, I've got your back." I took a deep breath, then put down the pen. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "They don't deserve to be there. This day is about celebrating love and support, and that's not something they've shown me." As I said the words, I felt like this huge weight lifted off my shoulders. It was a bittersweet moment, realizing that cutting ties with my toxic family was the right move for my future. Yeah, there was sadness, but also this overwhelming sense of relief. The weeks flew by, and before I knew it, our wedding day was here. As I stood in front of the mirror in my bridal suite, fiddling with my veil, I was hit with this sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. As I walked down the aisle towards Tom, I saw the faces of those who'd stood by us. Tom's parents, beaming with pride, my grandma, dabbing at her eyes with a hanky, friends and relatives who'd chosen to support us despite all the family drama. These were my people, the ones who'd shown me what real love and support looked like. When I reached Tom, he took my hands in his eyes shining with love. As we said our vows, I felt this sense of rightness settle over me. This was where I belonged. At the reception, surrounded by laughter and joy, I had this big realization. My engagement party, all those months ago, wasn't just about celebrating our upcoming marriage. It was the first day of my new life, a life where I wasn't an outsider anymore, but the creator of my own happiness. As Tom and I swayed to our first dance as husband and wife, I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling truly at peace. The journey had been tough, yeah, but it had led me here, to a place of strength, wisdom, and genuine happiness. "I love you," Tom whispered in my ear. "I love you too," I replied, my heart full to bursting. In that moment, I knew that whatever life threw our way, we'd face it together. And for the first time in my life, I was excited about the future, not scared of it. This was my fresh start, and I was ready to dive in headfirst. I never thought I'd be starting over at 35, but here I am, Dr. Tessa Thompson, dentist and soon-to-be business owner. It's been 3 years since I married Mike, a mechanical engineer, 5 years my senior. We live in my apartment. He says he left his to his ex-wife after their divorce. I don't know much about that part of his life, and I've never pushed. Our life together has been good, for the most part. I make a comfortable living as a dentist, but I've always dreamed of more. That's why I've been squirreling away every extra penny, denying myself little luxuries. My goal? Opening my own private practice. "You should do it, Tessa," Mike said one evening as we sat on our worn couch, the TV droning in the background. "You'd be great at running your own business." I looked at him, surprised by his enthusiasm. "You really think so?" He nodded, taking a swig of his beer. "Absolutely. My wife, the business owner. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" I couldn't help but smile. It did sound nice. "It'll be a lot of work," I warned him. "And money. We'll have to tighten our belts for a while." Mike waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that. We'll make it work. I'll support us for the first year while you get things up and running. You just focus on making your dream come true." His words filled me with warmth. This was why I loved him, his unwavering support, his belief in me. "Okay," I said, my mind already racing with plans. "Let's do this." The next few months were a whirlwind. I quit my job at the clinic, throwing myself headfirst into preparations. There was so much to do, getting licenses, finding the right location, renovations, equipment. Every day brought new challenges, new decisions to make. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of preparation, my office was ready. I stood in the doorway, taking in the gleaming equipment, the fresh paint smell, the neatly arranged waiting area. This was mine. All mine. As I locked up that first night, a mix of excitement and terror churned in my stomach. Tomorrow, I'd open my doors to my first patients. I was on my own now, sink or swim. The first few months of running my own dental practice were a whirlwind. I worked 7 days a week, from dawn till dusk, barely stopping to eat or sleep. My office became my second home, scratch that, my first home. I saw more of my dental chair than I did of my own bed. "Dr. Thompson, your next patient is ready," my receptionist, Lisa, would say, poking her head into my office. I'd nod, gulping down the last of my cold coffee. "Thanks, Lisa. Send them in." And so it went, day after day. Fillings, crowns, root canals, I did it all. When I wasn't with patients, I was buried in paperwork, learning the ins and outs of running a business. It was exhausting, but exhilarating too. This was my dream, after all. Mike and I became like ships passing in the night. When I left for work, he was still asleep. When I got home, he was already in bed. We communicated through hastily scribbled notes and brief text messages. "How's work?" I texted one day, during a rare quiet moment. "Fine," came the reply, hours later. I frowned at my phone. That was it? Just fine? But before I could dwell on it, Lisa was calling me for another patient, and thoughts of Mike were pushed to the back of my mind. Weeks turned into months. I was so focused on my practice that I barely noticed the changing seasons. Spring became summer, summer faded into fall. I was making progress, slowly but surely. My patient list was growing, and I was starting to see some regulars. "You're doing great, Dr. Thompson," Mr. Johnson, one of my first patients, said during a checkup. "This place is really coming along." I beamed at him. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. That means a lot." But for every high, there was a low. The stress was constant, the pressure immense. There were nights I'd come home and cry, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then I'd think of how far I'd come, how much I'd invested, and I'd pull myself together. I couldn't give up now. One particularly grueling day, I stumbled home well past midnight. The apartment was dark and quiet. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the couch, too tired to make it to the bedroom. That's when my phone rang. I groaned, fumbling for it in the dark. Who could be calling at this hour? "Tessa, is that you?" It was Mike's mother, Ellen, her voice tight with worry. I sat up, suddenly alert. "Yes, it's me. What's wrong?" "I've been trying to reach Mike all day," Ellen said. "He's not answering his phone." "I'm worried sick. There's been some kind of scandal at his work." My heart dropped. "Scandal? What scandal?" "I'm sorry, I don't know anything about this," I said, my mind racing. "I haven't really talked to Mike in a while." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh," Mike's mother said, her voice small. "I see. Well, if you hear from him, please ask him to call me." "Of course," I promised. "I'll talk to him as soon as I can." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, my exhaustion forgotten. What was going on with Mike? How could there be a scandal at his work that I knew nothing about? I found Mike in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm, despite the turmoil inside me. "Your mom called. She said there was some kind of scandal at your work." "What's going on, Mike?" He let out a long, shaky breath. "I quit my job, Tessa. About a month ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. "A month? You've been unemployed for a month and you didn't tell me?" "I didn't want to upset you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so busy with the practice, I didn't want to add to your stress." I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to process this information. "So what happened?" "Your mom mentioned a scandal." Mike ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was uncomfortable. I had a fight with my boss. He was being unreasonable, demanding more and more overtime without compensation. I stood up to him, things got heated, and I walked out. My pride wouldn't let me stay. I wanted to yell, to shake him, to demand why he thought his pride was more important than our financial stability. But looking at him, slumped and defeated, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I sat back down beside him. "What are you going to do now?" I asked softly. Mike shrugged. "I don't know. I think I might be suffering from burnout. I'd been thinking about seeing a psychologist, maybe taking a short break from work to figure things out." Part of me wanted to scream that we couldn't afford a break, that I was already working myself to the bone trying to keep my new practice afloat. But I swallowed those words. Mike needed support, not criticism. "Okay," I said, taking his hand. "If that's what you need, we'll make it work. But Mike, you have to promise me something. No more secrets. I need to know what's going on in your life, good or bad. Okay?" Mike nodded, squeezing my hand. "Okay, I promise." "I'm sorry, Tessa. I should have told you sooner." The next day, I called the clinic where I used to work and asked if they had any part-time positions available. It was a step backward, but we needed the extra income. As I hung up the phone, having secured the part-time position, I looked at Mike. He was on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. "I got the job," I said. "I start next week." He just nodded in response, as if it was something that was taken for granted. The next few months were a blur of exhaustion and stress. I'd wake up at dawn, see patients at my office until early afternoon, then rush to the clinic for my part-time shift. By the time I got home each night, I was dead on my feet. Mike, true to his word, started seeing a psychologist. He talked about burnout and needing time to recuperate. I tried to be supportive, but it was hard not to feel resentful as I watched him lounging on the couch while I worked myself to the bone. One evening, about 3 months after Mike had quit his job, I came home to find him in an unusually good mood. "Tessa," he exclaimed as I trudged through the door. "I've got great news. I got a job. It's with that engineering firm downtown. I start next week." Relief washed over me. Finally, things were looking up. "That's wonderful, Mike," I said, managing a tired smile. "We should celebrate." And celebrate we did. I splurged on a bottle of wine, and for the first time in months, we sat down to a meal together, talking and laughing like we used to. It felt good, like maybe we were getting back on track. But my relief was short-lived. A month into his new job, Mike came home fuming. "I quit," he announced, throwing his briefcase onto the couch. I froze, the plate I was washing slipping from my hands and clattering into the sink. "What? Why?" "The boss is a tyrant," Mike spat. "He wants complete control over everything. I'm not some puppet he can order around." "So what now?" I asked when he finally paused for breath. He shrugged. "I'll find something else. Something better. A job where they appreciate my skills and give me the freedom I deserve." I wanted to scream. To shake him and ask if he appreciated my skills, if he understood the freedom I'd given up to keep us afloat. But I didn't. I just nodded, turned back to the dishes, and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The weeks that followed were tense. Mike spent his days at home, supposedly job hunting, while I continued my grueling schedule. But more and more often, I'd come home to find him playing video games or watching TV. "Any luck with the job search?" I'd ask. "Nothing suitable yet," he'd reply, not looking away from the screen. "These companies just don't get it. I need something challenging, you know? With good pay and flexible hours." Then one day, Mike started talking about having children. "Wouldn't it be great to have a little one running around?" he said over breakfast. "I could stay home and take care of the kid while you work. It's the perfect solution." I stared at him, my coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips. "Mike, we can barely afford our current lifestyle. How could we possibly support a child?" He waved his hand dismissively. "We'll figure it out. You're doing great with your practice, and I'll find something eventually." "Come on, Tessa, don't you want to be a mom?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Of course I wanted children, someday. But not like this. Not when our marriage was hanging by a thread and our financial situation was so precarious. "I think we need to focus on getting our lives in order first," I said carefully. "Maybe when things are more stable." Mike's face fell. "You just don't understand," he muttered. "You're always so focused on work, you can't see what's really important." His words stung, but I didn't have the energy to argue. I just got up, rinsed my mug, and headed out to another long day of work. As the months dragged on, the tension in our household grew thicker. Mike's job search had become sporadic at best, and he spent more and more time immersed in his video games. I was exhausted, stressed, and increasingly resentful. One evening, I came home to find Mike excitedly setting up a new gaming console. "What's this?" I asked, my voice tight. He grinned, not noticing my tone. "Just got the latest system. The graphics are incredible." I felt my temper flare. "And how exactly did you pay for this?" Mike's smile faltered. I took some money from our joint account. But don't worry, it's an investment in my hobby. Once I start working again, I'll pay it all back." The argument that followed was ugly. Months of pent-up frustration and resentment came pouring out. We said things we couldn't take back, reopened old wounds, and created new ones. From that day on, I stopped putting money into our joint account. I paid the bills myself and bought groceries as needed. Mike was furious, accusing me of not respecting him and infringing on his rights. "I'm the man of this house," he yelled during one particularly heated argument. "I should be managing our finances." I laughed bitterly. "What finances, Mike? The money I earned that you spend on games and beer?" The atmosphere at home became unbearable. We barely spoke, and when we did, it usually ended in an argument. I threw myself into my work even more, using it as an escape from the disaster my personal life had become. Then came the day that changed everything. I was at home, catching up on some paperwork, when I overheard Mike on the phone with his parents. His voice drifted from the bedroom, animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. "Yeah, I need a new business suit for this job interview," he was saying. "It's a great opportunity, but I'm a little short on cash right now. Could you maybe help me out?" I felt a spark of hope. Was Mike finally taking his job search seriously? But as I listened, that hope quickly turned to ash. "Thanks, Mom. I really appreciate it. I'll pay you back as soon as I get the job." The call ended, and I waited, expecting Mike to come share the news about his interview. But he didn't. Instead, I heard the familiar sounds of him booting up his computer. Curious and increasingly suspicious, I quietly made my way to the bedroom door. What I saw made my blood run cold. Mike was online, not browsing job listings, but purchasing a new computer game and ordering a case of beer for delivery. I couldn't believe my eyes. He had just lied to his parents, begged them for money under false pretenses, and now he was spending it on alcohol and games? "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, pushing the door open. Mike jumped, guilt flashing across his face, before quickly being replaced by defiance. "It's none of your business. This is my money." "Your money?" I was incredulous. "You just lied to your parents to get that money. They think you're buying a suit for a job interview." The argument that followed was the worst we'd ever had. Finally, red-faced and shaking with anger, Mike grabbed a bag and started throwing clothes into it. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice hoarse from yelling. "To my parents," he spat. "At least they support me." As the door slammed behind him, I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a mix of anger, disappointment, and an odd sense of relief. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe. Days passed since Mike stormed out, and the apartment felt eerily quiet without him. On the fourth day, as I was finishing up with a patient, my phone buzzed. Mike's name flashed on the screen. My heart raced as I answered. "Hey, Tessa." Mike's voice was cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "I'm in Miami with my parents. Mom's always wanted to come here, so we decided to make a weekend of it." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "And how exactly are you paying for this trip?" There was a brief pause before Mike answered, his tone slightly less jovial. "Well, I had to borrow a couple of your credit cards. But don't worry. I'll pay you back many times over once I start this new job." I felt sick. "You took my credit cards without asking me?" "Come on, don't be like that," Mike said, his voice taking on that wheedling tone I'd grown to hate. "It's just for the weekend. I'll bring you back a nice shell from the beach, okay? Have a good weekend, honey." Before I could respond, he had hung up. In that moment, something inside me snapped. With shaking hands, I opened my banking app and blocked all my credit cards. Next, I called a locksmith. Within an hour, he was at my apartment, changing the locks. My final stop that day was a lawyer's office. I'd found her online, Sandra Patel, specializing in divorce law. "I want to file for divorce," I said, the words coming out easier than I'd expected. Sandra nodded, her expression compassionate but professional. "I understand, Dr. Thompson. We'll start the process right away. Can you tell me a bit more about your situation?" By the time I left her office, the divorce papers were being drawn up. As I stepped out onto the street, the late afternoon sun warming my face, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The sun had long set when my phone rang again. Mike's name flashed on the screen, and I braced myself as I answered. "Tessa? Thank God you picked up." Mike's voice was frantic. "Something's wrong with the credit cards. They're not working, and we can't pay for anything here. Mom and Dad are freaking out." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "That's because I blocked them, Mike. I didn't give you permission to use my cards." There was stunned silence for a moment before Mike spoke again. "Look, I'm sorry, okay?" His tone shifted to pleading. "We're already here on the coast. Can't you just unblock the cards? We'll sort everything out when we get back, I promise." I almost laughed at the familiarity of those empty promises. "No, Mike. I'm done sorting things out for you. You've put me in impossible situations time and time again. Now you can figure this one out on your own." "Tessa, please." He was begging now. "You're putting me in such an awkward position. My parents are here, we have no way to pay, this is your problem too." "No, Mike," I said firmly. "This is your problem. You created it, now you solve it. Goodbye." The next day, I took a personal day from work. I spent the morning packing up Mike's belongings, trying not to get caught up in memories as I boxed up his clothes, books, and the various gadgets he'd accumulated over the years. Once everything was packed, I called a storage facility and arranged for his things to be kept there. A few days later, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a call from Mike. I stepped out of my office to take it. "Tessa? I'm outside the apartment, but my key isn't working. Did you change the locks?" He sounded incredulous. "Yes, I did," I replied calmly. "Mike, I've sent divorce papers to your parents' address. You should be receiving them soon." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Divorce papers? Tessa, you can't be serious." "We can work this out, we always do." "Not this time," I said, surprised at how steady my voice was. "I packed up your things and sent them to a storage facility. I'll text you the details." "Tessa, please," he begged. "Let's start over. I'll change, I promise. Just give me one more chance." I closed my eyes, memories of all the last chances flashing through my mind. "No, Mike. It's over. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be with me. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of emotions, sadness for the end of what we once had, relief that it was finally over, and a growing excitement for what the future might hold. For the first time in years, that future was entirely up to me. A few weeks after I'd sent Mike's belongings to storage, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Tessa? It's Ellen, Mike's mother." I braced myself, expecting a tirade about ruining their Miami trip. But Ellen's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I owe you an apology, Tessa," she said, catching me off guard. "I had no idea what Mike has been putting you through." As Ellen spoke, the pieces of Mike's past began to fall into place. She told me about Mike's first wife, how she'd left him due to his chronic irresponsibility. Ellen had hoped Mike had changed, that our marriage would be different. "When we got back from Miami and I learned the truth, how he'd been lying to you, stealing your money, I was devastated," Ellen confessed. "I kicked him out of the house. I couldn't enable his behavior anymore." I felt a wave of empathy for this woman who'd raised Mike, who'd hoped for the best for her son. "It's not your fault, Ellen," I said softly. "You didn't know." "Still, I'm so sorry for what he's put you through," she replied. "You didn't deserve any of it." After we hung up, I sat in silence, processing the conversation. It was oddly comforting to know that I wasn't alone in being disappointed by Mike. In the weeks that followed, Mike made several attempts to reconcile. He showed up at my office, flowers in hand, pleading for another chance. He waited outside my apartment, trying to catch me as I came home. Each time, I refused to engage. I knew now that he wouldn't change, that we'd end up in the same cycle if I let him back in. As time passed, I found myself settling into a new rhythm. Without Mike's expenses draining our accounts, I was able to focus fully on my practice. I left the part-time clinic job, pouring all my energy into my own office. I hired a marketing consultant, and soon my patient list was growing steadily. 6 months after filing for divorce, I hired 2 more dentists to help with the increased workload. It was a joy to see my little practice flourishing, to know that all my hard work was finally paying off. A year after Mike left, I made the final payment on my business loan. To celebrate, I booked a weekend trip to a nearby spa resort. Something I'd always wanted to do but had never allowed myself to splurge on before. As I lounged by the pool, sipping a fruity cocktail, I marveled at how much my life had changed. Now, as I sit in my expanded office, looking over plans for a new wing to accommodate more specialists, I can't help but feel proud of how far I've come. The past 2 years have been a journey of self-discovery and growth. I've learned to value myself, to trust my instincts, and to never settle for less than I deserve. Who knows what the future might bring? For now, I'm content knowing that whatever comes next, I have the strength and wisdom to handle it. My story isn't over. In many ways, it feels like it's just beginning.